Hey there. Thanks for joining me tonight. We often imagine royalty surrounded by beauty, comfort, and elegance. But just outside the glow of the crown, in the quiet corners of cold stone chambers, someone else was always watching, always waiting. Tonight, we'll step into the soft, worn shoes of a maid. A woman who rose before the queen and slept long after her, whose life was ruled by bells, glances, and quiet commands. It may sound like a privileged place, but it wasn't. Behind the silks and polished silver was a world of exhaustion, silence, and invisible suffering. No privacy, no voice, and no escape. This isn't a tale of rebellion. It's a slow, gentle uncovering of what it meant to serve completely, in a world where your worth was measured by how well you disappeared. If this calm storytelling helps quiet your thoughts or gently leads you closer to sleep, I'd love it if you gave a soft like or subscribed to hear more of these quiet histories. This space was made to soothe you, and you're always welcome here, so take a deep breath in and let it go. Tonight, we'll follow the footsteps of someone history rarely names. A woman who lived in the shadow of a throne and carried far more than just the queen's gowns. Let's begin. In the grand corridors of Elizabethan England, where silk rustled against stone and whispers echoed louder than footsteps, the queen's personal space was considered the holiest of realms, but few ever thought about who cleaned it. This is the story of a job no one envied. Cleaning Queen Elizabeth I's chamber pot. You wake up before dawn. It is cold, always cold inside the stone walls of the palace, even in spring. You are a chambermaid, but more precisely, you are one of the Queen's women. Not a lady-in-waiting of noble blood, no. You are among the lowest ranked, yet most vital members of Her Majesty's household. Your job begins in the shadows. While others dream in you shuffle through corridors with a brass key hanging from your waist. This key opens the Queen's private chamber. That alone is enough to cause envy or suspicion. The Queen's privy chamber is not quite private, despite the name. Everything that happens there is governed by strict routine and rank. Maids like you do not speak unless spoken to. You do not turn your back on the Queen. You certainly do not comment on what you clean. Your main duty: emptying, scrubbing, and preparing the chamber pot. What was often called the close stool. It was a finely crafted piece of furniture, padded with velvet, often perfumed. But beneath all its finery, it held what every stool holds: human waste. It was your job to approach the stool after the Queen used it, remove the porcelain bowl inside, and carry it sometimes still warm down winding steps to be emptied, cleaned, and returned. The odor was no less noble than anyone else's. The risk of infection, no less dangerous. You wore no gloves. The concept of sanitation was rudimentary. Soap was rare, and water was cold. And yet, this task was considered an honor. The role of the gentlewoman sewer. The Tudor court had titles for everything, and one of the strangest was the gentlewoman sewer. No, this had nothing to do with actual sewage. A sewer was someone who served dishes at the royal table and oversaw hygiene matters related to the Queen's body and meals. You were beneath even her. In many cases, it wasn't just one person handling the stool. The gentlewoman would supervise, and maids like you carried out the orders. There were strict timings. The Queen rose at a fixed hour, and her body needed to be attended to before the first visitor was allowed in her chamber. You had to move quickly, efficiently, silently, and always. Invisibly. The irony. You were close enough to know the Queen's health better than most physicians. You saw changes in color, texture, smell, clues to ailments long before they were visible. But you could never speak of it. Servitude in silence, being a chambermaid to Elizabeth, wasn't only about pots. There were linens to be changed every day. Her Majesty's bedsheets were bleached in lye and sun-dried, and you were responsible for smoothing them without wrinkles. The nightgown she wore had to be warmed by body heat or stone bricks. You were the one who held the bricks or lay on the sheets before they touched royal skin, but you couldn't make eye contact, not without permission. You would carry the scent of lavender oil and sweat on your hands, the perfume she used to cover the odor of illness, the pox scars under her makeup. Those details stayed with you. Still, your own name was rarely spoken. You might have family elsewhere, but you couldn't marry. You might become pregnant then, who would empty the pot? A job no one dared refuse to us. The task sounds degrading. But in the court of Elizabeth I, this role was offered only to those trusted beyond measure. You were in the Queen's chamber. You heard what was said when the doors were closed. You knew when she wept, when she didn't sleep, when her food disagreed with her. You knew her as a person, not just a monarch, and that made you dangerous. So, the women selected were often from families with proven loyalty. No scandals, no brothers who could be spies. Even then, your life was one of total control. You ate separately. You slept in shared, cold quarters. You were never allowed to speak to visitors unless granted permission. Your daily schedule revolved around the Queen's body when she rose, when she bled, when she bathed, and when she needed to sit in silence on her throne. Of porcelain, the physical toll. Few consider the toll of this life. Bending constantly, lifting heavy wooden chairs, hauling full chamber pots down narrow stairs without spilling a drop. You'd rise at 4 a.m. and often collapse at midnight. You smelled of vinegar used to mask odors. You developed sores on your fingers from scrubbing. You inhaled fumes from lye. And when your back hurt, there was no treatment, no break, number. Thanks, sometimes, a queen's glance was reward enough. Other times, it was a sharp word, a warning, or worse, dismissal. And yet, there were worse fates in Tudor England. Reflection, you were close to royalty, closer than most courtiers or foreign dignitaries would ever be. But at what cost? Your back, your privacy, your voice. What does it mean to serve a monarch so intimately, yet remain completely unknown? If you've followed the Queen's chambermaid this far, you already know her life was not only about mopping and lifting. It was a life full of invisible rules, ones not written on parchment, but etched into glances, footsteps, and silence. Every breath near the Queen was measured, every mistake magnified. In this section, we descend even deeper into the subtle systems of control, punishment, and fear that governed the most trusted women in the Tudor court. The hierarchy among maids, not all maids were equal, not even close. There was the mistress of the robes, always a noblewoman whose name appeared in official records. Beneath her, ladies of the bedchamber, who dressed and advised the Queen. Then came the chamberers and maids of honor, young women from noble families being groomed for marriage alliances. And finally, there were chambermaids, working women, women like you. But even among chambermaids, there was an invisible ladder. The one assigned to the chamber pot had a level of access unmatched by even some nobles. That proximity came with a dangerous price. You had no title, but your every movement was monitored by both court officials and other jealous servants. Whispers were deadly. One misplaced word about the Queen's moods, her skin condition, her digestion could be interpreted as treason. After all, what better way to undermine a monarch than to expose her humanity? So you became a ghost. You trained yourself to forget what you saw. You learned not to flinch when the queen's legs were exposed, not to react when her illness flared, and most importantly, never to appear too loyal. That too was suspicious. The dangers of court intrigue palace life was not like village life. Everything was about positioning, literal and social. You could be punished not only for speaking out of turn, but for standing in the wrong place, too close to the queen's bed. Why were you hiding something, waiting to eavesdrop? The Tudors were particularly paranoid. Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, had been executed. Her father, Henry VIII, had wives beheaded for less than a whisper. Elizabeth never forgot that. Neither did her maids. Maids were often asked questions by courtiers, pretending to be polite. A simple "How is Her Majesty this morning?" could be a trap. If you answered too warmly, you were accused of sharing private matters. If you declined to speak, you were considered cold or even defiant. Even the Queen herself would test you. She might ask if her breath smelled sweet or sour, or if her hair looked better tied or loose. The wrong answer, too flattering, too honest, could mean exile from court. Or worse, reassignment to cleaning latrines in the lower levels of the palace, where sewage ran beneath your feet and the smell clung to your skin for weeks. Illness, infection, and the chambermaid's curse. It wasn't only politics that threatened. The job itself carried constant health risks. Queen Elizabeth's hygiene routines were advanced for the time, but compared to modern standards, they were deadly. She bathed rarely, sometimes once a month. In between, her body was wiped with cloth soaked in rosewater or vinegar. Her cosmetics contained lead, which slowly poisoned her skin. Her teeth decayed over time, causing her breath to grow sour and her appetite unpredictable. All of this was observed and managed by you. The chamber pot, though regal in design, often splashed or cracked. You carried the Queen's bodily waste through tight corridors, past flickering candlelight and uneven floors. One stumble could ruin your entire future. Imagine slipping, the contents spilling onto your gown, perhaps soaking your apron. Who would you tell? There were no second chances. The shame could follow you for years even if no one saw. Cuts and burns from scrubbing, infections from old linens, or even exposure to mercury fumes used in makeup, all of it slowly chipped away at your health. But you were not allowed to complain. Maids did not get sick. If you fainted, you were lazy. If your fingers bled, you hid them. Discipline, and obedience due to discipline, was swift. For a chambermaid, infractions ranged from the absurd to the cruel. A wrinkle in the Queen's bedsheet could mean being assigned to night duty for a month. Failing to curtsy deeply enough might lead to bread and water rations for a week. Being seen speaking with a male servant was grounds for instant dismissal, public punishment. And yet, punishment didn't always mean dismissal. Sometimes, it meant being kept even closer so your suffering was more visible. You might be assigned to air the Queen's bedding on the coldest nights, or fetch her early morning wash water from the river. Barefoot, obedience wasn't just expected, it was tested. One chambermaid in Elizabeth's court was once ordered to repeat every sentence she heard while cleaning. It was a trick to see if she would reveal anything inappropriate. She failed and was sent away. Moments of humanity yet. Amid the fear and formality, there were rare flashes of human connection. Elizabeth, though commanding, was not unfeeling. She knew her maids sacrificed their youth and health. Occasionally, she offered gifts, a used ring, a velvet scrap from an old gown, or once, a single kiss on the forehead. These gestures could sustain a maid's loyalty for years. A few maids were even allowed to leave court with a small note from the Queen's secretary confirming that they had served with honor. This paper could change their future. They might be accepted into another noble household, or even, rarely, allowed to marry. But those were exceptions. Most chambermaids faded from history. Their names were not recorded in ledgers. Their backs broke in silence. Their lungs darkened from lie, and when they finally left Cortif, they were lucky enough to do sit was with swollen fingers, poor eyesight, and the invisible imprint of royalty on their every breath. A slow disappearance as the years passed. You would notice new maids entering the Queen's service. Younger, stronger, quieter. You might train them. You might envy them. You might warn them, quietly, about the small things. How to fold the Queen's nightgown. How to wait 5 seconds before entering her chamber. How to count to 4 before answering any question. But eventually, the Queen would forget your face. You would be reassigned, or quietly let go. And yet, if anyone asked years later, what was the greatest honor of your life, you would still say, I was close to the Queen. What does it mean to serve power so closely, only to be forgotten completely? You've seen what it meant to wake in the dark, walk in silence, and carry not only the Queen's waist, but also her secrets. Now we step into the final, often unseen, chapter of a chambermaid's life. When the court turns away, and the Queen forgets your face, what remains of your years in royal service. In this section, we explore what happened after the stool was no longer yours to clean. The quiet exit, no trumpets marked your departure. No ceremony. One day your name simply vanished from the duty rolls, your key taken from your waist, your straw mattress in the servants' hall given to a younger girl. You were not dismissed, not formally. Instead, you were quietly allowed to leave. A phrase that in Tudor times meant little more than you were no longer useful. There were no pensions for maids, no retirement cottages in the country. If you were lucky, you left with your health. If you were especially fortunate, you left with a letter, a good reference, written by a higher-ranking lady, often a lady of the bedchamber. Might read something like, she served with modesty and obedience, without blemish to her name. Those words, few and carefully chosen, were sometimes the difference between starvation and survival. If you had family in the countryside, you might return to them. But you returned changed, used to silence, used to obeying without question, trained to keep your eyes down and your words few. In a village full of blunt voices and open laughter, you would seem strange. Some former maids married usually not for love, but to survive. A butcher's apprentice, a widower with children, a retired soldier missing 2 fingers. Others found places in smaller noble households as nursemaids or laundresses. They never worked for queens again, and some disappeared completely, no records, no graves with names. Illness, scars, and the lingering cost of royal service. Your body bore the cost of your service more than your memory did. A lifetime of scrubbing on stone floors damaged your knees. Years spent inhaling lye and vinegar made your lungs weak. The cold water you hauled at dawn numbed your joints with early arthritis, and there were scars invisible to others. You flinched at loud voices. You had dreams of the Queen's voice, calling your name with neither affection nor cruelty, just command. You still folded your own linens with military precision. You still washed your own hands before touching food, even when there was no queen to judge you. Perhaps the most lasting injury was to your sense of self. You had lived so long as a shadow in someone else's world. It was difficult to believe in your own. What the Queen never knew Queen Elizabeth I, commanding and intelligent, likely never knew your name. To her, you were one of the many bodies that hovered around her bed, adjusted her pillows, folded her nightdress, and kept her privy chamber pristine. She may have noticed your absence for a day or two, perhaps asked, "Where is the quiet one?" and then, never again. But you knew her more intimately than most. You saw her unpainted face in the morning light, pale and lined. You watched her weep, alone in the dark, whispering the name of her mother and Bullen before sleep. You cleaned the basin after she vomited during illness. You folded the chemise she bled into during her monthly pains. You knew the monarch not in marble or portrait, but in sweat, waste, and weariness, and you carried that knowledge into the world like a locked chest no one ever asked you to open. A fading legacies centuries later, historians would write about Elizabeth's court with awe. They would analyze her speeches, her victories over Spain, her handling of Parliament. They would describe the gilded halls, the glittering gowns, the dazzling dancers, but they would not mention you, the chambermaid who woke before dawn, who touched royal skin without being seen, who scrubbed away the evidence of human frailty behind the throne. There are no records of what happened to you, only guesses. Maybe you died in childbirth. Maybe you married and lived long, dull years in a cottage beside the sea. Maybe you fell into poverty and were buried without a marker, your fingers still stiff from decades of folding royal linens. But your work mattered. You kept a queen standing. Every grand history is built on the backs of invisible labor. For every crown placed on a queen's head, there is someone who washed the cloth it rested on. For every royal decree, a maid folded the parchment. For every portrait painted in velvet light, someone had to light the fire that warmed the queen's skin. You were never remembered, but without you, she could never have ruled. And perhaps, in the end, that is a kind of power too. Before the sun touched the stone walls of a Tudor palace, before birds began to stir in the frost-bitten hedges, and long before anyone dared knock on the Queen's door, you were already awake. You were a maid of the bedchamber, one of the Queen's closest servants in name, though not in privilege. Your world revolved around royal routine, embroidered silence, and service so precise it could be measured in seconds. This is not the life of a noblewoman. You are not here to gossip or hold court. You are here to rise before dawn, carry warm bricks under your apron to heat the Queen's bedding, and adjust the silken drapes around her canopy bed so that no morning light reaches her face. Too soon, you do not belong to yourself. You belong to the Queen. The role no one understood. Most imagined that maid of the bedchamber was a glamorous position. After all, you helped dress the Queen. You touched her hair. You entered her bedchamber when no man could. But the reality was far more grueling. Your role sat awkwardly between servant and shadow. You were not paid generously. Your rank in the household was fragile, and it depended entirely on your obedience. You had access to the Queen's body, but no voice in her presence. At the crack of dawn, Your first job was to check the fire. The queen must never wake to cold air. You stoked the embers, fanned the flames, and placed flat irons near the hearth, so they would be warm by the time her undergarments were needed. Then came the linens. You smoothed out the wrinkled sheet beneath her body, gently and without shifting her weight too much. If the queen stirred, you apologized softly and only once. Too many words were considered impertinent. Next, her garments. You laid out her shift, corset, and petticoat in exact order, folding each corner neatly, preparing them in silence while the other women of the chamber entered. No one spoke loudly. It was an unspoken rule. Noise near the queen before she opened her eyes was grounds for punishment. Dressing the monarchs the moment the queen awoke, your day changed. The calm of morning broke into a flurry of motion. You did not dress her alone, ever. That duty was shared with higher-ranking women, often noble ladies of the bedchamber, or even the mistress of the robes, depending on the queen's mood or political climate. You were the silent facilitator. You fetched what was asked, knelt when told, stood back when not needed. Imagine the layers: a linen shift, then corsets, stiff with reeds or bones, then petticoats, farthingales, to widen the hips, sleeves, and bodices, sewn with pearls. Each piece had to be tied, laced, or pinned perfectly. Mistakes meant discomfort. Discomfort meant blame. Blame meant reassignment or worse. The queen did not tolerate errors. If a pin pricked her skin or a ribbon hung uneven, the room froze. You would feel her eyes on you before she said a word. The smells of the chamber desks bite the silks and perfumes. The queen's chambers were not as fragrant as people imagine. She bathed infrequently. You wiped her body with cloths soaked in rose water, vinegar, or herbs. You combed her hair to remove lice carefully, so that no strands were pulled. A single flinch from the queen could ruin your day. Powder made of starch or crushed pearls covered her face. It clung to the air, settled in your throat. The cosmetics stung your eyes, but you said nothing. You were there to serve, not to breathe. The bed itself was aired daily, its linens inspected for stains or signs of illness. You held your breath as you folded them, not from shame, but from duty. Illness in the queen meant tension in the court. You could be questioned, suspected, or blamed. The clock that controlled your life was governed not by the hour, but by the queen's body. If she bled early, you adjusted her gowns. If she slept late, breakfast was delayed. If she wanted to pray, you knelt. If she dismissed you, you disappeared. You were never off duty in the way we understand it. Even during meals or moments of rest, you stayed within earshot. The bell might ring. The queen might cough. A hairpin might fall. And when it did, you moved quickly, but never too quickly. Swift motion could be seen as panic, and panic near. Royalty was a kind of insult. The emotional toll you witnessed more than anyone. Not the public queen, but the private one. You saw her cry on nights when her suitors sent cold letters. You saw her face without makeup, the lines deepening with stress, the reddish marks of illness around her mouth. You saw her weary, confused, exhausted, and ill. But you were not allowed to karat, least not openly. Emotional expression from a maid was considered a breach of etiquette. If you wept when the queen was sad, you were too familiar. If you looked worried when she coughed, you were presumptuous, so you trained your face to be neutral. You became invisible, and slowly you lost the ability to feel much of anything at all. The queen's voice, sometimes the queen spoke directly to you. She asked if the linen was soft, if the fire was warm, if the dress was heavy. You answered with short, careful replies. These were dangerous moments. If you said something clever, it could be interpreted as flirtation or ambition. If you spoke too little, you might be accused of disloyalty. Your words had to balance on the finest, edge informative, neutral, humble. Sometimes you were asked questions meant to test you. Do you think I look pale today? Did Lord Dudley glance at me at supper? Is this gown too youthful for a woman of my age? There were no correct answers, only safe ones. A job without endeavour. After the queen was fully dressed and gone from her chamber, your work continued. You folded each piece of nightwear, aired out the bedding, scrubbed the bowl she used to rinse her mouth, polished the silver mirror, and swept the floor by hand. Every object she touched was sacred, every trace of dust, dangerous. You had no privacy, no time of your own, no dreams that didn't involve the queen's voice calling your name at odd hours. But despite everything, there was a strange sense of pride. You knew the queen's rhythms better than her advisors. You anticipated her moods. You caught her gown before it snagged. You adjusted her pillow without being told. You existed entirely in the service of another person's life, and for some reason that felt like purpose. Final thought: when you spend every hour measuring your breath, your words and your hands for the sake of someone else's comfort, do you forget how to live for yourself? You've watched the queen rise, dressed her without error, and responded to her questions with the careful precision of someone who knows that even kindness can be a trap. But serving in the bedchamber wasn't just about silence, order, and obedience. It was about knowing more than anyone else and being trusted less than most. In this section, we move beyond the linens and lace into the world of court surveillance, silent rivalries, and the dangerous intimacy of royal service. Because the closer you were to the queen, the more likely you were to fall. Knowing too much, your maid of the bedchamber knew everything that mattered before anyone else did. You knew when the queen's monthly cycle began and ended. You knew if she bled more than usual. You knew if she took to bed early or paced all night. You were the first to hear her cough, see her stumble, notice the bruises from tightly laced gowns, or the sores on her feet from standing through endless audiences. But no one wanted to hear those facts. Court physicians were men. They relied on reports from women like you. But if your report contradicted political interests, you said she looked tired when the Spanish ambassador was expected, it could be seen as sabotage. So you lied. You said Her Majesty is in excellent health, even when you helped her hold a chamber pot the night before. Silent wars between women among the other maids. There were no open battles, but there were wars, quiet and cruel. A misplaced bodice pin could be seen as sabotage. A whispered comment about the queen's figure could be used as a weapon. If you were seen lingering too long in the presence of the queen's favorite lady, rumors would swirl that you were trying to gain influence. Every mistake you made, another maid would silently take note. Some would report it, others would wait, until you made 2 or 3 and then strike privately, through whispers, to noblen. You couldn't trust anyone. Not fully. There were favorites, of course. A maid with better embroidery skills might be asked to sit closer to the queen during her leisure time. One with a prettier voice might be asked to sing softly during the queen's midday rest. Those privileges, however small, created resentment. If you were seen helping a lady of the bedchamber with her corset or pinning her hair before an outing song, outside your duty, other maids would mark you as a climber. The punishment wasn't formal. It was subtle. Your shift would be hidden. Your linens would be folded wrong. Your turn to speak with the steward about needed supplies would be delayed. And so you learned. Royal chambers weren't just places of service, they were battlegrounds. Without blood, the fear of gossip, more dangerous than rivalry, was gossip. If you were seen too close to a gentleman of the court, even if it was only to pass him a handkerchief, the queen dropped. Tongues would wag. You could be accused of trying to seduce him for favor or worse, of carrying messages for the queen in secret. Rumors didn't need to be true to destroy you. Some maids were dismissed on suspicion alone. A flirtatious smile, a laugh overheard. A servant reporting you lingered in a hallway for too long. You lived every hour with the fear that your name would appear in a whispered sentence passed between noblemen, or scribbled in a note to a court advisor. It only took one misplaced word. One maid Margaret, a girl just 17 once, confided to another that the queen seemed unwell after a long walk. 2 days later, she was gone. No explanation. Her space in the dormitory filled by someone else before nightfall. No one mentioned her again. Private pain. Public performance. Perhaps the most painful part of your work was pretending not to care. You saw the queen at her most vulnerable. Blood, weeping over lost suitors. Staring into the mirror in fear as her beauty faded. You handed her a robe when she collapsed. You held her hair back when she vomited. You cleaned the blood from her sheets during illness and whispered calming words when she shook with fever. And yet, when she rose to greet ambassadors, you had to act as though none of it had happened. You were expected to mirror the queen's strength. She was immortal, untouchable, divine. And you were the scaffolding, holding up that illusion, quietly, invisibly. Religion and ritual and prayer was performance. The queen prayed regularly, and so did you kneeling beside her, even when your knees bled. You bowed your head, repeated the words, but you didn't feel them. You couldn't, not because you weren't devout, but because you had no space for belief. You were too busy surviving the court itself. Still, you moved your lips in rhythm. You crossed yourself when she did. You adjusted her prayer book's ribbon exactly to the last psalm she read. You became an extension of her movements. Not a believer, just a mirror. When you were not needed, there were days the queen asked for privacy. You'd be dismissed from her chamber before sunrise. No explanation. Sometimes it was because she was unwell and did not want witnesses. Other times, a favorite courtier visited early, and she wanted no interruptions. On those days, you waited just beyond the chamber door, holding a folded petticoat in your arms for hours, unsure whether to knock again, unsure if you'd be blamed. for not being inside when needed. You were always in danger of being either too present or not present enough. The closer you are to power, the more you must erase yourself. But what happens to a person who spends years becoming invisible? What do they see that others never will? You've entered the Queen's chamber before her eyes opened. You folded her linens, tied her bodice, watched her illness, concealed her secrets, and outlasted countless whispered betrayals in the corridors. But what becomes of a maid of the bedchamber when her service is done? This final section explores the ending of a life lived in whispers. What happened to the maids who spent years in quiet servitude, and what legacy, if any, they left behind? Most were never named in records, never mentioned in memoirs. But without them, queens like Elizabeth, I couldn't have ruled at all. The day you are dismissed, dismissal didn't always come with warning. Sometimes it arrived in the form of silence. One day, you enter the Queen's chamber as always, linen in hand, bodice ribbons arranged. But the door is already opened, and someone else, a younger maid, stands inside, smoothing the sheets you used to touch. A lady of the bedchamber turns to you, politely, almost kindly, and says, "Her Majesty will no longer require your presence." Just like that, your service ends. There is no pension, no medal, no written history of what you've done. The Queen's voice does not call after you. The bed you slept in will be taken within the day, your few possessions folded into a cloth sack, and your name never written, forgotten. When you leave the court, if you are fortunate, a lady may grant you a written letter of character, brief and stiff, but valuable. She served Her Majesty with restraint, diligence, and silent loyalty. Those words, stamped with a wax seal, could open doors to other households. You might find work as a laundress, a wet nurse, a personal maid to a lesser noble. The work is no easier, but at least it comes without the crushing weight of royal eyes. Some former maids returned to their families' aging parents in villages, distant cousins who ran taverns or farms. But returning was not always welcome. You had lived by court rules for too long. You didn't laugh like others. You flinched at raised voices. You still waited for permission to speak, and others simply disappeared into convents, into taverns, into poverty. The palace did not keep records of their lives after service. No. One asked what you saw, no one asked what the Queen looked like without paint. No one asked what she muttered in sleep. No one asked how many times you caught her when she stumbled from her chair. No one wanted to know the truth. They only wanted the myth. You carried that myth on your back every day. You carried it quietly and well. You were the one who kept the curtains drawn when the Queen cried. You were the one who straightened her skirts when her hands trembled. You made her look unshakable, and now that you were gone, one remembered your name. But your absence was felt in small ways. The folds of her dress sat differently. Her slippers were colder. Her routine was not as smooth. The Queen might not say it. She might not even consciously know it, but she missed your hands. The toll on the body, years of kneeling, lifting, holding still, and breathing shallowly leave scars. Your hands are twisted. Your joints ache. You cannot sleep in softness anymore, it feels too foreign. You miss the sounds of the palace, the clink of morning wash basins, the rustle of skirts, the sharp knock of heels on polished floors. These noises meant routine. Now your world is quiet and disorienting. Your body remembers service. You wake before dawn, even when you don't need to. You wash your face in cold water, even when warm water is available. You fold everything, even your food cloth, with perfect corners. And when someone addresses you, you lower your eyes not out of shame, but habit. What you leave behind, most maids left nothing behind but quiet impressions. Some were remembered in private journals, named only as the silent one or the quick-handed girl. One or two were painted accidentally blurry figures in the background of royal portraits, holding trays or fluffing pillows, but most left no trace. Still, the role mattered. Without you, the queen's hair would have frayed, her image imperfect, her power diminished. Without you, her robes would have sat crookedly, her shoes pinched, her prayers interrupted. You made it possible for her to be seen as divine, because you carried the burden of her human needs. One final duty, and then, perhaps, one day, the queen herself begins to fail. Her appetite wanes. Her voice grows weaker. The court dems. You, long retired, hear the news in a letter or whispered rumor. The queen no longer rises from her bed. There is talk of succession, of her final wishes. But all you think of is the fire that won't be lit, the cold chamber that won't be warmed, the shift that won't be folded, and for a moment you remember the sound of her breath before waking, the weight of her robes, the stillness before she opened her eyes. You remember it all. No one asks you to return, but you light a candle anyway. Final reflection: you gave your life to someone else's image. You breathed in time with another's voice. You erased your needs to elevate theirs. Does a person vanish entirely when they live only in service? Or do they leave something behind? In the softness of sheets, in the hush of courtly mornings, in the mirror of every woman who has ever carried power alone. You wake before the palace stirs. The velvet curtains of Versailles are still drawn tight against the pale dawn, and the gilded halls echo only with your own footsteps. You are not a noble. You are not even a lady. You are a perfume maid, trained in the science of scent, but paid in silence and sweat. Your job: to ensure the Queen of France, Mary Antoinette, never smells like the truth. In a world of perfume, fountains, and powdered wigs, your job isn't beauty, it's disguise. You cover the smells of unwashed bodies, sweat-drenched corsets, and rotten court politics, but no one remembers your name. Versailles, without plumbing. The Palace of Versailles may have been the jewel of Europe, but it stank. There was no indoor plumbing. Courtiers relieved themselves in corners, behind tapestries, or in ceramic pots. The stone floors soaked up urine. The summer heat ripened everything. Rotten food mingled with sweat, perfume, animal droppings, and the scent of wet wool. So while the nobles danced and powdered their wigs, it was women like you who walked through the stink armed with scented linen, vinegar water, and sachets of dried flowers. Your main job was to prepare the Queen's heir, sent as power and protection. Queen's body was a political object. How she looked mattered. How she smelled mattered more. You were trained to monitor her scent at all times, each morning. Before the Queen's toilette, you arrived with a tray of carefully selected perfumes: orange blossom for calm lavender, for purity jasmine to mask body, odor ambergris, waxy substance from whales used to preserve scent on the skin for hours. These weren't luxuries. They were necessities. If the queen ever smelled of sweat, it would be whispered as scandal, and that scandal could unravel alliances. The morning preparation you arrived before the queens, ladies in waiting. Your job began with scenting the chamber. You burned, scented, pastilles in small silver pots, then wiped surfaces with cloth dipped in rose vinegar. The bedding had to be discreetly. Refreshed her sheets, sprinkled with orris root powder. Her undergarments warmed by the fire, then lightly scented with lemon balm or violet. Then came the perfumes themselves. The queen did not bathe often. Most people didn't. So perfumes were layered on skin that hadn't seen water in days. It was your job to dab scent behind her ears, across her chest, under her arms, and along her wrists. You did this without eye contact. Without speaking, it was considered immodest for the queen to apply perfume herself. That's what you were for. The politics of smell scent at Versailles wasn't just about comfort. It was a language. If the queen wore narrowly, it signaled tranquility. If she wore musky ambergris, it meant formality, diplomacy, war. You were instructed often, at midnight, to switch out perfumes if an ambassador arrived early, or if the queen woke in a foul mood. You once scented her gloves in haste, only to be scolded because the queen found the musk too heavy. The gloves were discarded. You were not. But you spent the next 2 weeks cleaning chamber pots as punishment. Your tools of the trade. You carried a small leather pouch with glass vials of essential oils, a silk cloth for blotting skin, a tiny spoon to measure powdered scents, a curved knife to scrape wax from candles for reuse. Also carried recipes in your mind, formulas taught by older scent maids who'd learned them from apothecaries and midwives. You knew how to distill flowers, preserve petals in alcohol, steep orange peels, but no one at court asked how you learned. They only cared that you made the queen smell like a Bookhaven on days when she barely rose from her bed, hiding what shouldn't be known. In some days, the queen's body betrayed her. Illness, menstrual bleeding, fainting spells. You were there to erase those things. The scented linens you carried weren't just for beauty, they were shields. You dabbed bloodstains with rose water. You wiped away sweat with lemon leaves. You layered scent upon scent upon scent. You made her inhuman, untouchable. You knew what she really smelled like, but you never said, never hinted. Because if you did, you wouldn't just lose your job. You might lose your life. The cost of smelling like roses. The oils you used were caustic. Prolonged exposure left your skin red, your lungs raw. You inhaled powdered flowers and crushed minerals every day. You often fainted while working, overcome not by emotion, but by lack of oxygen. And she never smelled the same without you. You do not serve in the royal dining hall. You do not fetch perfume. You do not lace up gowns or prepare jewelry trays. You serve behind a locked door, where the queen's visitors dare not step, and the scent of flowers is replaced with vinegar and sweat. You are a linen made in the queen's sick chamber, role few desire, but someone must endure. The queen is not dying, not yet, but she is unwell often, and when that happens, she is moved from the royal chambers into a set of quieter rooms, known only to a few, and it is your job to keep her linens, her sheets, her bandages, her clothing, her bedding clean enough to avoid a deeper disaster. This is not a tale of politics or power. This is the story of a woman who fought disease with boiling water, saved a queen's body with soaked rags, and carried filth on her back hall without recognition. what it meant to serve the sick queen too. Serve in the queen's recovery wing was not a glamorous appointment. In fact, it was nearly a punishment. But not for you, you volunteered. Not out of love or admiration, but out of something quieter. The understanding that someone must care for the body when it fails, not just when it dazzles. Most noble courtiers stayed away from illness. Disease was a reminder that monarchy was not divine. So when the queen fell ill, fatigue, fever, stomach afflictions, or weakness, the court whispered. She was quietly removed to her reserved sick chambers, and you followed. As her linen keeper, the morning boiler day began at a copper vat. You stoked the fire beneath the basin until the water hissed. In went the bedsheet, soaked in sweat, mucus, or blood. You stirred them with a wooden pole, sleeves rolled high, smoke clinging to your hair. The water burned your skin if you moved too quickly. You added vinegar, rosemary, lye soap. Your job was not just to wash, but to disinfect as much as the 17th century. Knowledge of contagion allowed. The sheets had to return white, unscented, warm, and most of all, safe. Because if you failed, and the queen's fever returned, the physician would ask questions not of the body, but of the linen. The queen's skin and the cloth that touched it, too, understood her skin better than most. Thin and pale when she was ill, it bruised easily. It broke open at the base of her spine when she lay too long. You watched for these signs. You folded the sheets so no seams pressed against her back. You padded her pillows to avoid bed sores. You never touched her directly, but your work did. Every rag, every cloth, every folded gown passed through your hands. You inspected them for louse eggs. You flicked off bits of dried vomit. You stitched hems to keep them from fraying. If she bled during the night, you knew before anyone, and you kept it quiet. The smell of survival royal illness did not smell sweet, even a queen. When fevered, sweated through 3 shifts in a night. You changed her bedding in silence, rolled the soaked sheets away before sunrise. You learned to breathe through your mouth. You wiped the floor with linen that once touched her skin. Her breath was sour. Her chamber pot was full. Her lace collars came back damp, yellowed, crumpled. You didn't flinch. You just kept boiling. And no one thanked you. When the queen spoke, you occasionally, rarely she spoke to you once. You were folding her 3rd petticoat of the day, now limp with fever sweat. She turned her head on the pillow and whispered, "You never cough." "I like that." You said nothing, only nodded. Another time she murmured, "Tell them not to bring flowers. They remind me of death." You removed the flowers. Those moments never made it to court gossip. They were not remembered in memoirs. But they were real, and in some way, they kept you going. You versus the doctor. You came to hate the physicians. They saw the queen for 5 minutes at a time, asked her questions she was too tired to answer, placed fingers on her pulse like it was ceremony. Then they would turn to the steward and say, "Her bedding must be changed more often. Her night shifts are too damp. She needs more pillows. Better ones." As if you hadn't already done those things. You knew her better than they did. You could tell when her fever was breaking by the smell of her sheets. You could sense if her stomach pain was worsening based on how she curled in bed. But you were a maid, and maids did not offer diagnoses. When you were sick, if you fell ill, you were removed instantly. There were no recovery rooms for linen maids. A single cough, a flushed cheek, a single sign of dizziness and you were sent away. Not to be treated, not to be comforted, just gone. A younger maid would step in. One who didn't know how to fold the sheets just right. One who didn't recognize the queen's quiet signs. One who didn't understand that lavender water made the queen nauseous in fever. But no one asked for you back. You were invisible. Final reflection, you kept her body clean when it failed. You held disease at bay with soap and soaked cloth. You served where no one wanted to look. And when she recovered, you disappeared again like a fever dream. She half remembered, but the queen never truly healed without you, and she never truly ruled. Without clean sheets beneath her, your hands at raw, your sleeves always damp, and the hallway leading to the queen's sick room smells faintly of vinegar, bile, and panic. By now, you know this work is not about service, it's about survival. In Section 2, we step deeper into the reality behind the tapestries, the invisible epidemics, the blame games, and the eerie balance between superstition and responsibility. Because when the queen's health declined, someone always had to answer, and more often than not, it was the maid who touched her sheets. The linen files no one read every week. You recorded what linen was used, discarded, or burned. You scribbled notes: Tuesday, night shift heavily stained. Replaced at 2 a.m. Thursday, sheet changed after vomiting. Mild fever odor present. These weren't just scribbles. These were medical logs in your own hand. But they weren't kept in the physician's cabinet. They were folded and tied into a pouch, tucked beneath your mattress. Because if something went wrong, if the queen worsened or died, your only protection was proof that you had noticed, that you had acted. No one told you to do this. You learned it from the girl before you, who vanished after the queen caught a chest infection. She had no record. She couldn't prove she'd done her work. You would not make that mistake. Disease. Behind brocade royal chambers were not safe havens. They were incubators, warm, unventilated, and heavy with dust. Windows were rarely opened, especially in winter. Fires burned constantly, consuming air and throwing soot. Servants passed in and out with trays, gloves, and letters. The queen herself was rarely alone, even in sickness. And yet, any outbreak, no matter how minor, was blamed on you. It didn't matter if the noblewomen sat too close, or if the physician didn't wash his hands. If a rash appeared on her chest, if her cough deepened, the eyes turned to your wash basin. Were the linens truly clean? They would ask, boiled properly, dried long enough. You once heard a noble say, "You know, some maids reuse cloth. It saves time." You hadn't, but that didn't stop suspicion. The ritual of the boiling sheets became your ritual. You heated the water with kindling stolen from the scullery fires. You added vinegar, rosemary, even crushed garlic, anything that might fend off what you couldn't see. You watched for fleas, lice, or strange stains that defied explanation. Your room was the hottest in the lower servants' wing. It smelled of smoke and sour cloth, but it was the one place where you had control, where the queen's illness met your resistance. Sometimes, when the fever was especially high, you would prepare 3 shifts a night, and still the steward would ask, "Why is her back damp in the morning?" Because no one, not even a queen, could keep dry when her body betrayed her. The blame game maids were expendable. When the queen's fever didn't break, someone had to be punished. First, the scullery boy was dismissed, then a kitchen girl, then one of the footmen. None of them had entered her chamber, but the court had to appear in control. And firing staff was easier than admitting they knew nothing about illness. When the queen developed an abscess on her thigh, they blamed the wrong soap. You had not prepared the soap. You said nothing. When she vomited after dinner, they blamed her dessert. You had not touched the food. You said nothing when she refused to eat for 3 days. They whispered about poison. You kept boiling the sheets. The maid with the burned arms there was another linen girl before Eucelist. She once scalded herself on the copper basin badly. Her arms blistered and peeled for weeks. Still, she worked. She wrapped her burns in linen and kept folding gowns, changed the queen's nightclothes, dragged sheets to the fire with her elbows when her hands failed. When she collapsed in the hallway from fever, she was removed within. The hour no physician saw her, no prayer was said. She was replaced the same night. You asked where she'd gone. Someone said, she's with the poor sisters now. A convent, a cage, a tomb. You never asked again. When the queen cried, you once heard the queen cry. Not weep, not dramatically, but cry the way the ill do, quietly, repetitively. A sound like breathing through cracked glass. She whispered someone's name, not yours. You stood in the corner of the room, folding a pillowcase, pretending not to hear. She turned away from you in her sleep, but in that moment, you saw something. Not majesty, not strength, just a body, fragile and failing, being held up by sheets you had boiled with your own hands. Unwritten rules of silence. There were things you never repeated. The yellow stain on the queen's bodice that the laundress couldn't remove. The raw patches on her legs from chafing against stiffened skirts. The way her voice cracked when she begged not to be turned onto. Her side. These things weren't yours to tell, but you remembered them, and that was the real weight of service. Not the lifting, not the scrubbing, not the sleepless nights. It was carrying memory in a world where you could never speak. Final reflection. You weren't just the linen maid. You were the first to touch illness, the last to see it leave. You fought disease with boiling water and willpower. You were invisible, replaceable, but without you, the queen would have died alone in her sweat, and the court would have blamed the weather. The queen recovered, or she didn't, but the chamber eventually fell quiet. The sheets lay still, the physicians moved on, and you who had worked through every groan, every soaked shift, every sleepless hour were no longer needed. This is the end of your story. Not in a scandal, not in a reward, but in something quieter, crueler, erasure. You were the closest to the queen's body when it suffered, but once it healed, there was no room left for you. The final sheets you folded her last fevered linens in silence. You recognized the signs. Her appetite had returned. Her skin felt cooler. Her movements regained a kind of grace. She was stepping back into her royal mask. And when that happened, you had to disappear. The steward informed you, the queen has returned to her official rooms. You'll be reassigned, not thanked, not acknowledged. You waited for a moment. Perhaps the queen would ask for you. Perhaps she'd recall the way your hands didn't tremble when hers did. But no request came. So you boiled the final basin. You wrapped the cloths with care. And you walked out. The new maid, there was always a new girl. She was younger. She smiled too much. She smelled of lemon balm. She hadn't learned yet that courtly work was mostly waiting. Waiting for illness. Waiting for punishment. Waiting to be noticed. You watched her press linen against her cheek and say, "I think she loved these." You said nothing, because loving something never kept you safe. You were the queen's shadow when she slept through fever dreams. You adjusted her limbs. When she stained her gown, you cleaned it without question. When she lost control of her breath, you counted the seconds between gasps. You were not a friend, not family, not even acknowledged, but you were a constant. And now that she was better, she would never know how close she came to not surviving, how close anyone comes when left alone with a fever. You knew, because you had seen others not recover. Sickness comes for maids too. When you fell ill weeks later, no one noticed. You didn't cough in front of others. You didn't complain when your knees gave way carrying the wash basin. You didn't explain why you were slow folding the queen's outer gowns, but your breath shortened. Your muscles ached. You recognized the signs. The difference was, you had no private chamber, no physician, no fresh linens changed 3 times a day. You had the corner of a dormitory and a blanket shared with 2 others. You didn't last long. What the records say there is no name listed beside linen made to the queen. There is no record of your removal, no thanks written into memoirs, no journal mentions your service, no page describes your death. The queen's diary says simply, recovered, fully by end of month. Linen improved. Your small acts. You never saved a life with medicine. You had no access to miracles, but you folded every cloth with care, changed shifts before the queen could wake, damp-soaked cloth in cold water when her fever burned, hid every stain before the courtiers entered, burned every cloth too soaked to reuse, made her healing possible. Even if no one knew, you gave her the dignity of dryness, of comfort, of not feeling like she was rotting alive. That was your legacy. Final reflection. You were the hand that lifted damp cloth, the one who boiled away the sickness no one wanted to see, the woman who touched death and made it tolerable. You were never seen, never thanked, never remembered. But when the queen opened her eyes and saw clean linen beneath her, she never thought of you. And that is how most of history is written, not by those who were saved, but by those who were allowed to forget the ones who did. The saving don't, it's not even dawn, but the cold is already biting your fingertips. You wake in a linen shift so thin, it does nothing against the chill. The stone beneath your feet is colder than the sky outside. You wrap yourself in your shawl wool, but threadbare, and begin your day in silence, because the queen's winter chambers must be warm before she opens her eyes. You are the firemaider, servant responsible for managing the heat in the queen's private apartments. It sounds simple. It is not, because in a time before central heating, winter was deadly. The palace was cold by design. Versailles was built for spectacle, not comfort. The walls were made of stone. The windows, too large and ill-fitted, let in freezing drafts. The fireplaces were more decorative than functional, and insulation was unheard of. Even the queen, wrapped in silk and fur, could feel the cold in her bones. That's why you were there. Your job was to fight the cold before it reached her skin. You were awake before everyone, crouched beside empty grates, dragging logs twice your weight through narrow back corridors. You carried fire irons hot enough to blister, and sometimes lit a dozen fireplaces before breakfast. No one saw you work, but if the queen shivered when she rose from bed, you were summoned. The tools you carried, you didn't wear jewelry. You didn't carry perfume. Your tools were scorched gloves, splintered tinderboxes, and a canvas apron covered in soot. In its pocket, flint and steel beeswax starters, rag soaked in lamp oils, more bones of dried lye soap to clean the grates. You learned how to listen to wood, how to test it with a tap, how to smell if it would smoke too much or too fast. Green logs would blacken the queen's chamber walls. Wet logs would hiss and die. Pines snapped too loudly. You needed perfect wood, and you needed it at 4 in the morning. When the queen was cold, she never said it. She didn't have to. If her hands trembled while holding her lace fan, if she refused. Her morning chocolate, if she delayed dressing it, meant she was cold, and someone had failed. You were never named directly. The steward simply said, "The queen is chilled today," and that was enough. You might be demoted, you might be reassigned, you might be made to clean the ash room for a month, but if she was warm, if she smiled at the firelight, if her dog curled up on the rug without a shiver, you still heard nothing. No praise, no glance, just silence. How you fought the cold, you learned to cheat. When the logs weren't dry, you coated them in animal fat. When the flue was blocked, you pried it open with a bread knife. When you had no beeswax, you used your own apron threads. There were no rewards for creativity, only the avoidance of failure. One winter, the pipes froze in the servant wing. Several maids caught pneumonia. One died. But you still lit fires. Your fingers turned red, then white, then blue at the tips. You warmed them over the coals, blew on. Them kept going. The queen's fire could not go out. Not once, even if yours did. When the logs ran out, it happened more than once. The wood supply ran low, either poorly ordered or hoarded for the king's chambers. You were given damp bark, old furniture scraps, broken crates. You burned them all. One day, you burned a small footstool carved with lilies. The queen never noticed, but another maid did. She looked at you and said, that was from her first child's nursery. You said nothing. You watched the lilies turn to ash. It was that, or let the queen freeze. The unseen war heat was power at Versailles. The closer you were to the hearth, the more important you were. Noble women jostled for chairs by the queen's fireplace. They wore silks that did nothing in the cold, but they preferred to suffer beautifully. You wore wool that scratched. You kept your distance. Sometimes you watched them warm their hands, while you shivered in a draught near the back of the room. Your hands were black with soot. Theirs were covered in lace, but only one pair of hands had lit the fire. Yours, final. Reflection: no one remembered who kept the queen. Warm in winter, only whether or not she was warm. You gave her comfort, heat, life, and when you walked home at night back to a shared cot, 2 thin blankets, 2 aching joints, you held no warmth for yourself. You were the firekeeper, but no one ever brought you a flame. There's ice on the inside of the window panes now. You can see your breath with every exhale, a faint cloud in the shadows of the queen's chamber. You've already been up for hours, your skin cracked from smoke and wind, your apron stiff with soot. You lit the fire. You stoked it again and again and again. But the queen still says, "It's so terribly cold this morning." And so begins another day where your failure is invisible and your suffering irrelevant. In this section, we step deeper into what it meant to serve as the Queen's fire, made in the heart of winter. The rituals, the punishments, the diseases, and the ways coldness itself became a caste system inside the royal palace. The day the ashes overflowed one morning. After 3 consecutive shifts of near-constant fire tending, the ashes overflowed. Hadn't slept. You forgot to empty the grate. The Queen entered her dressing chamber, waved her hand in front of her nose, and said, "Why does it smell like a poor house?" Within the hour, you were summoned and scolded, not just by the steward, but by the mistress of the household herself, a woman who had never lifted a single log but understood the politics of cleanliness better than anyone. The raw patches on her legs from chafing against stiffened skirts, the way her voice cracked when she begged not to be turned onto. Her side, these things weren't yours to tell, but you remembered them, and that was the real weight of service, not the lifting, not the scrubbing, not the sleepless nights. It was carrying memory in a world where you could never speak. Final reflection, you weren't just the linen maid. You were the first to touch illness, the last to see it leave. You fought disease with boiling water and willpower. You were invisible, replaceable, but without you, the Queen would have died alone in her sweat, and the court would have blamed the weather. The Queen recovered, or she didn't, but the chamber eventually fell quiet. The sheets lay still, the physicians moved on, and you who had worked through every groan, every soaked shift, every sleepless hour were no longer needed. This is the end of your story. Not in a scandal, not in a reward, but in something quieter, crueler, erasure. You were the closest to the Queen's body when it suffered, but once it healed, there was no room left for you. The final sheets you folded her last fevered linens in silence. You recognized the signs her appetite had returned. Her skin felt cooler. Her movements regained a kind of grace. She was stepping back into her royal mask, and when that happened, you had to disappear. The steward informed you, the Queen has returned to her official rooms. You'll be reassigned, not thanked, not acknowledged. You waited for a moment. Perhaps the Queen would ask for you. Perhaps she'd recall the way your hands didn't tremble when hers did. But no request came. So you boiled the final basin. You wrapped the cloths with care. and you walked out. The new maid, there was always a new girl. She was younger. She smiled too much. She smelled of lemon balm. She hadn't learned yet that courtly work was mostly waiting. Waiting for illness. Waiting for punishment. Waiting to be noticed. You watched her press linen against her cheek and say, "I think she loved these." You said nothing, because loving something never kept you safe. You were the queen's shadow when she slept through fever dreams. You adjusted her limbs. When she stained her gown, you cleaned it without question. When she lost control of her breath, you counted the seconds between gasps. You were not a friend, not family, not even acknowledged, but you were a constant. And now that she was better, she would never know how close she came to not surviving, how close anyone comes when left alone with a fever. You knew, because you had seen others not recover. Sickness comes for maids too. When you fell ill weeks later, no one noticed. You didn't cough in front of others. You didn't complain when your knees gave way carrying the wash basin. You didn't explain why you were slow folding the queen's outer gowns, but your breath shortened. Your muscles ached. You recognized the signs. The difference was, you had no private chamber, no physician, no fresh linens changed 3 times a day. You had the corner of a dormitory and a blanket shared with 2 others. You didn't last long. What the records say there is no name listed beside linen made to the queen. There is no record of your removal, no thanks written into memoirs, no journal mentions your service, no page describes your death. The queen's diary says simply, recovered, fully by end of month. Linen improved. Your small acts. You never saved a life with medicine. You had no access to miracles, but you folded every cloth with care, changed shifts before the queen could wake damp-soaked. Cloth in cold water when her fever burned, hid every stain before the courtiers entered, burned every cloth too soaked to reuse, made her healing possible. Even if no one knew, you gave her the dignity of dryness, of comfort, of not feeling like she was rotting alive. That was your legacy. Final reflection. You were the hand that lifted damp cloth, the one who boiled away the sickness no one wanted to see, the woman who touched death and made it tolerable. You were never seen, never thanked, never remembered. But when the queen opened her eyes and saw clean linen beneath her, she never thought of you. And that is how most of history is written, not by those who were saved, but by those who were allowed to forget the ones who did. The saving don't, it's not even dawn, but the cold is already biting your fingertips. You wake in a linen shift so thin, it does nothing against the chill. The stone beneath your feet is colder than the sky outside. You wrap yourself in your shawl wool, but threadbare, begin your day in silence, because the queen's winter chambers must be warm before she opens her eyes. You are the fire maider, servant responsible for managing the heat in the queen's private apartments. It sounds simple. It is not, because in a time before central heating, winter was deadly. The palace was cold by design. Versailles was built for spectacle, not comfort. The walls were made of stone. The windows, too large and ill-fitted, let in freezing drafts. The fireplaces were more decorative than functional, and insulation was unheard of. Even the queen, wrapped in silk and fur, could feel the cold in her bones. That's why you were there. Your job was to fight the cold before it reached her skin. You were awake before everyone, crouched beside empty grates, dragging logs twice your weight through narrow back corridors. You carried fire irons hot enough to blister, and sometimes lit a dozen fireplaces before breakfast. No one saw you work. But if the queen shivered when she rose from bed, you were summoned. The tools you carried, you didn't wear jewelry. You didn't carry perfume. Your tools were scorched gloves, splintered tinderboxes, and a canvas apron covered in soot. In its pocket, flint and steel beeswax starters, rag soaked in lamp oils, mole bones of dried lye soap to clean the grates. You learned how to listen to wood, how to test it with a tap, how to smell if it would smoke too much or too fast. Green logs would blacken the queen's chamber walls. Wet logs would hiss and die. Pines snapped too loudly. You needed perfect wood, and you needed it at 4 a.m. When the queen was cold, she never said it. She didn't have to. If her hands trembled while holding her lace fan, if she refused, her morning chocolate, if she delayed dressing it, meant she was cold, and someone had failed. You were never named directly. The steward simply said, "The queen is chilled today," and that was enough. You might be demoted, you might be reassigned, you might be made to clean the ash room for a month, but if she was warm, if she smiled at the firelight, if her dog curled up on the rug without a shiver, you still heard nothing. No praise, no glance, just silence. How you fought the cold, you learned to cheat. When the logs weren't dry, you coated them in animal fat. When the flue was blocked, you pried it open with a bread knife. When you had no beeswax, you used your own apron threads. There were no rewards for creativity, only the avoidance of failure. One winter, the pipes froze in the servant wing. Several maids caught pneumonia. One died. But you still lit fires. Your fingers turned red, then white, then blue at the tips. You warmed them over the coals, blew on. Them kept going. The queen's fire could not go out. Not once, even if yours did. When the logs ran out, it happened more than once. The wood supply ran low, either poorly ordered or hoarded for the king's chambers. You were given damp bark, old furniture scraps, broken crates. You burned them all. One day, you burned a small footstool carved with lilies. The queen never noticed, but another maid did. She looked at you and said, "That was from her first child's nursery." You said nothing. You watched the lilies turn to ash. It was that, or let the queen freeze. The unseen war heat was power at Versailles. The closer you were to the hearth, the more important you were. Noble women jostled for chairs by the queen's fireplace. They wore silks that did nothing in the cold, but they preferred to suffer beautifully. You wore wool that scratched. You kept your distance. Sometimes you watched them warm their hands, while you shivered in a draught near the back of the room. Your hands were black with soot. Theirs were covered in lace, but only one pair of hands had lit the fire. Yours, final. Reflection: no one remembered who kept the queen. Warm in winter, only whether or not she was warm. You gave her comfort, heat, life, and when you walked home at night back to a shared cot, 2 thin blankets, 2 aching joints, you held no warmth for yourself. You were the firekeeper, but no one ever brought you a flame. There's ice on the inside of the window panes now. You can see your breath with every exhale, a faint cloud in the shadows of the queen's chamber. You've already been up for hours, your skin cracked from smoke and wind, your apron stiff with soot. You lit the fire. You stoked it again and again and again. But the queen still says, "It's so terribly cold this morning." And so begins another day where your failure is invisible and your suffering irrelevant. In this section, we step deeper into what it meant to serve as the queen's fire, made in the heart of winter. The rituals, the punishments, the diseases, and the ways coldness itself became a caste system inside the royal palace. The day the ashes overflowed one morning. After 3 consecutive shifts of near-constant fire tending, the ashes overflowed. Hadn't slept. You forgot to empty the grate. The queen entered her dressing chamber, waved her hand in front of her nose, and said, "Why does it smell like a poor house?" Within the hour, you were summoned and scolded, not just by the steward, but by the mistress of the household herself, a woman who had never lifted a single log but understood the politics of cleanliness better than anyone. But they were your quiet protection. When the fabric bit back, the clothing could be cruel. Boning left bruises. Lace collars scraped. Stiff skirts crushed her ribs when she sat. You knew where her body ached, because your own body bore the same bruises. You laced up her corset. Then you unlaced your own at night and found the same red marks. You knelt to tie her garters, then rubbed your own knees in the laundry closet. You held her skirts above puddles, then wrung out your apron in silence when it rained. You served, in pain, but her pain had pearls on it. Yours was simply invisible. You were her mirror. She looked to you for confirmation, not with words, but with a glance. After the final pin, after the final bow, she would turn slightly and wait, not for applause, but for approval. And you gave it with a nod, a softened breath, a hand smoothing down a sleeve. It was a contract. You make her beautiful. She lets you stay. Final reflection, you held her body every day, not in desire, not in friendship, in duty. You made her regal when she could barely stand. You stitched her seams when her hands trembled. You masked her sweat with lavender. You covered her sorrow in silk. And then, when the court saw her and smiled, they never once imagined you. But without you, there was no queen, only a tired woman, with no dress, no structure, no crown. You know what her gowns hide. You've touched them, folded them, washed them, hidden their stains, reinforced their seams, and stitched over the spots that revealed too much. Sweat, milk, blood, bruises, and tears. You've kept secrets better than any chamberlain, because beneath the gold-threaded gowns and royal jewels, the queen's body does what every body does, and you are the one who must erase that truth. This section dives deeper into the unseen. Labor, silent humiliations, and bodily realities that you, the dressing maid, must manage daily without flinching, reacting, or being noticed. The first bloodstain happened during a court festival. The queen, seated under glittering candelabras, smiled through it all. But as you helped her undress that night, you noticed it, a bloom of dark red on the underside of her gown. Hidden from the nobles, soaking through the expensive fabric. A tear fell silently down her cheek. She said, "Burn it." You didn't. You scrubbed it in silence. The blood didn't fully lift. You patched it with lace from the lining of your own apron. She never noticed. But you knew that gown would never be worn again. Sweat and the summer courtsummer was cruel. Her corset clung to her skin. The lace sleeves stuck to her arms. Her underlayers were soaked by midday. Powder clumped at her temples. The roses in her hair wilted within the hour. You were responsible for all of it. You powdered her, shoulders to prevent chafing. You rubbed crushed mint onto the cloth beneath her arms. You lined her petticoats with lemon water to mask the smell. Still, there were days when she would whisper, "Am I unpleasant?" And you would answer, "Never, Your Majesty," even when you were washing her fourth shift of the day at midnight. When she couldn't. With a gown there were days she physically couldn't. A bruise from riding, a swollen knee, a fever rash down her back, or a corset scar that had split open again. She would motion for her favorite gown, and you'd have to say, "Perhaps the blue one today, Your Majesty. It's softer." You never said, "Because it won't." Press on your wound. You learned to speak in suggestions, not truths, and in doing so, you protected her pride as much as her skin. The morning she was sick one morning, you found her curled on the floor near the foot of her bed. She had vomited on her silk slippers. Her nightdress was wrinkled and damp with sweat. She was breathing unevenly. The physician had not yet been summoned. No other maid was present, and for a full moment you did nothing. Not from cruelty, from shock. Then you moved. You cleaned her face with her own silk handkerchief. You removed the slippers. You gathered her hair. You wiped the floor. She said nothing. The next morning, she didn't acknowledge it had happened. But when you held out her corset, she said, "Looser, please." The corset bones that snapped, you'd seen it only once. A corset so tight, the whalebone snapped as she was being laced. The cracks sounded like a branch breaking in snow. She flinched, but she didn't gasp. You caught the broken piece before it scratched her, quietly replaced it with one from an older corset you had hidden in your sewing chest. One she hadn't worn in years. No one noticed. But that night, you soaked your fingers in vinegar to soothe the ache. Her body changed with pregnancies, with stress. With time, her hips widened, her shoulders slumped, her legs bore more weight, her arms bruised easily. Gowns that once flowed now pinched. Gloves that once fit now required powder to slide on and use silently. Delio adjusted everything to preserve the illusion. You added darts to sleeves, extended waistlines, shifted hooks ever so slightly, tightened ribbon ties across hidden seams the queen still believed she wore. The same sizes, but her clothes were changing around her, and you made that possible when you were her twant. A pin slipped and jabbed your finger. You bled onto a silk hem, you gasped. The queen turned. You pressed your finger to your apron, then folded the blood-stained edge inward, smoothed it, pretended it was part of the design. She said, "Is it ready?" You nodded, then continued dressing her, while blood soaked the inside of your glove. Final reflection, you handled the evidence of her humanness and wiped it clean. You made her body seem effortless, even when it was breaking down. You held the secrets her clothing couldn't reveal, never dropped a single one. Her silks glowed. Her corsets fit. Her shoes never showed wear. But you, your fingers were calloused, your knuckles cracked, your back bowed from bending over a woman who never saw your face when she looked in the mirror. You made her divine by erasing the proof that she was anything but. The gowns come off in reverse. You slip the gloves from her fingers, unclasp her pearls, untie the corset strings, one by one. The queen exhales relief, perhaps, or simply habit. She does not thank you, but this moment, the undressing, is when you see her most clearly, raw, tired, real, and it's the moment that marks the beginning of your end. In this final section, we explore how dressing the queen was not just a job, was a silent calling, one that consumed your time, your body, your thoughts, until the day it didn't, until you were replaced, quietly, completely, as if you were never there at all. The sound of silk falling, it's not loud, it's a sigh, a whisper of fabric, a breath leaving a body that's held itself upright all day. As you undress her, layer by layer, the queen seems smaller, not weak, just spent, the crown removed, the posture dropped, the ceremonial smile gone. You fold her garments as you go. Chemise, petticoat, stays, bodice, skirt, sleeves, all folded with care, all placed precisely. No wrinkles. She rarely speaks in these moments, but once she said, "This dress feels heavier." Each time you almost answered, "It's not the dress," but you only nodded, because you were not allowed to speak truths. The final gown, you touched it, was an ivory velvet with gold thread cuffs, worn at a ceremony that dragged into the late night. When she returned, her hands were trembling. Her shoes were removed at the threshold. Her shoulders sagged. She sat without being asked. You undid the buttons slowly. She winced at one there. Was a bruise on her side. She didn't ask where it came from. You didn't ask either. You folded the dress. You left the room. You didn't know it would be the last time, but it was. The next morning you arrived at her chamber at the usual hour, tray of accessories in hand, hands scrubbed, apron starched. A new girl stood by the wardrobe. She didn't look at you. She was adjusting the lace cuffs. The steward saw you and said plainly, "Her Majesty has requested a change." That was all. No reason, no warning, no farewell. You stood in silence, then turned and left. You were not dismissed. You were reassigned to laundry. Detail. Below stairs, you saw gowns you once folded, now tossed in piles. You washed silk under cold water, scrubbed at stains you once prevented. You recognized your own stitchy handiwork, now faded. The queen never called for you again, and still, you knew her measurements by heart. What the queen wore after Yushi still looked perfect. The folds fell right. The hems hovered. The gloves fit. But there were small differences. You saw them, others didn't. A veil too short for a morning ceremony. A bodice too tight on the wrong day. Shoes squeaking against a polished floor. The new maid hadn't learned her yet, but she would. And in time, she would disappear too. Your life became a seam. You no longer touched the queen's body. You touched her leftovers, her sleeves, her collars, her discarded stockings. You repaired what others tore. You washed what others soiled. You bleached what the queen bled through. And each day, you became less of a person and more of a stitch in the palace. Invisible, necessary, forgotten. Final reflection, you dressed the queen not just in cloth, but in confidence, illusion, and power. You bore her weight, hid her flaws, softened her edges. You were the last to touch her skin before the world did, and now you fold garments in silence. You are not thanked. You are not remembered. But the queen walks through every corridor wearing the calm you once wrapped around her. She faces the court armored in the quiet work of your hands. She smiles, unaware that her grace was once built on your back. You didn't disappear, you simply faded. Like a perfume no one names, but everyone misses when it's gone. You do not enter the room. You wait just outside, just outside. Back straight, hands folded, eyes down, always listening, never interrupting. You are the maid of the chamber, door a roll so minor, so still, that most courtiers forget you're there. But you hear everything, and that is what makes your job dangerous. This story explores a form of royal service that required constant presence without recognition, and the unspoken power of the invisible listener, woman who was never allowed to react, but who witnessed the hidden machinery of the court unfold. From just outside the Queen's door, you are not the guard, you wear no sword. You do not bark orders. You do not raise your voice. Your job is not to protect the Queen from the outside world. It's to prepare the inside world to receive her. You ensure the Queen is never startled, that no one enters without being announced, that her ladies are informed when she is tired, that her physician does not arrive during her headache, that her husband does not barge in during the wrong hour. You are the filter. The stillness before the Queen. The training you were never taught, no one tells you how to stand still for 4 hours without moving. No one explains how to knock, just loud enough, but not too loud when the Queen is asleep. No one shows you how to listen to footsteps and recognize who is coming down the corridor by their pace, their perfume, the jingle of their rings. But you learn who enters smiling and leaves frowning. You learn which footsteps mean trouble. You learn the exact tone the Queen uses when she's lying. And you never say a word. You become furniture visitors, forget you're human. They speak as they pass by you. They drop comments meant for no one. They complain about their shoes, their debts, their frustrations with the Queen. You hear them all, and if they glance at you, they glance through you. Once, a nobleman said, "Even the Queen's doors are better dressed than her maids." He was looking right at you. When you were noticed, it didn't happen often, but it was never good. If the Queen noticed you, it was usually because something went wrong. Once, a visitor arrived unannounced. She blamed you. Another time, her lapdog got loose through the open door. You were held responsible. You didn't speak in either case. You nodded. You took the punishment. A week without bread. A shift scrubbing privy tiles. Your silence was your safety, but also your prison. The things you weren't supposed to hear, you heard confessions, not whispered ones, but the kind people speak aloud when they think they're alone. A lady weeping over a stillborn child. A courtier whispering about a lost fortune. A visiting ambassador speaking ill of the Queen in a language he didn't realize you understood. You carried these things like coins sewn into a hidden hem. They weighed more than any crown. The door itself, you came to know the Queen's door better than anything else in your life. Its hinges creaked in a specific pattern. The latch stuck slightly when the weather changed. The paint chipped along the lower edge where people scuffed it as they knelt. When you closed it softly, you could feel whether the Queen had had a good day or not by the way the chamber sounded. From inside, joy echoed. Misery did not. You stopped breathing sometimes, especially when you heard raised voices behind the door. When the Queen's tone turned cold. When someone was dismissed abruptly. In those moments, you stood completely still, because if the door opened suddenly, and your expression betrayed what you'd heard, you could lose everything. Final reflection: you never entered the Queen's inner world, but you were its first boarder. You caught glances no one saw. You memorized voices no one remembered. You watched time pass by, the threshold gowns rustling, perfumes changing, faces aging, and yet you were not a character in the story. You were the comma between scenes, the silence between questions, the breath before a royal speaks. When people spoke of the Queen's grace, her poise, her composure, they never knew how often she paused at the door, gathered herself, and only then stepped into the world. She never said thank you, but she always waited for you to open the door first. There are no paintings in your hallway, no windows either, just a stretch of polished stone and velvet runners that whisper beneath noble boots. You stand at your post, spine pressed to the wall, arms folded at your waist, staring at nothing but absorbing everything, because your corridor isn't empty. It is a funnel for secrets. This section peels back the layers of life as the Queen's threshold may the quiet custodian of palace whispers. It reveals how every day you were bombarded with stories, confessions, betrayals, all of which you could never respond to, and none of which you could ever forget. The corridor never sleeps, it is never truly quiet, even in the dead of night. Servants move through it with trays of broth, towels, ink, and medicines. Physicians pace nervously. Pages whisper and scribble. Lovers slip past like shadows. You've memorized every sound. You can tell if a tray is being carried by a right-handed or left-handed servant by the clang of silver. You know when someone's gait is slowed by hesitation or guilt, and sometimes you hear nothing at all, and that's the loudest sound of all. You witnessed shame. Without faces, you never turned your head, but your ears betrayed you. You've heard illegitimate confessions of fatherhood, quiet bribes between visiting dukes and wet-eyed footmen, a maid offering herself to a page for a key that might unlock advancement, a whispered threat about poisoning wine ever followed through, but never reported, and you stood as still as the door. The Queen's lover came at midnight. He never said his name. He didn't need to. He wore the same scent each time, moved with purpose, smiled with teeth, never with eyes. You opened the door for him. No words. He disappeared inside when he left. He smelled like her. You closed the door behind him, then turned and resumed your place. No one ever asked, and you never volunteered. When a lady tripped, it was a minor noblewoman, flustered and drunk from a failed flirtation at dinner. She tripped over her own train right outside the Queen's door. You caught her briefly, lightly. She swore at you, said you smelled of vinegar, called you a rat with hands. Then she turned her smile back on as the door opened and entered the chamber with dignity. Restored, you returned to your wall and whispered nothing of it to anyone. a death behind the door. One winter morning, the queen's sister passed away unexpected, sudden. You heard the moment the queen was told, not with words, but with a gasp. Don't then, a silence so sharp it sliced through the wood. The priest entered, then the physician, then her husband. You stood still the entire time. No one opened the door to let you in, but grief seeped through like smoke. You became invisible for safety. There came a point where people no longer greeted you, not out of cruelty, out of fear. They feared what you might have overheard. You were no longer just a servant. You were a silent witness, and no one trusts a witness with no name. The night you were threatened, one courtier, red-faced and furious after being denied entry to the queen's chambers, turned to you and said, "You forget your place. You're not a wall, you're a worm." Then he leaned close. "I could have you reassigned with a single word." You didn't flinch, because you knew if he feared you enough to threaten you, then you mattered, even if your only power was stillness. Final reflection: you were the boundary between chaos and calm. You filtered the noise. You absorbed the storm. You braced the queen's chamber with your silence. They all thought you stood there because you were lowly, but truly, you stood there because you could be trusted to vanish, and in a palace built on appearance that made you more valuable than most. No one wrote your name in the histories, but every secret kept behind that door. It passed through you first. It ended the way many things end in palaces, without warning, without ceremony, without thanks. One morning, you arrived as usual before sunrise, apron pressed, hair pinned, shoes quiet. But the steward stood in your hallway, not at his desk, not by the ledger, right in your spot. He looked at you and said, "There's been a reassignment." Just like that. No crime, no explanation, just a closed door. This final section explores the quiet dismissal of the queen's most invisible maid, the fading out of a woman whose entire life had been spent listening, and how that silence became permanent when she was no longer needed. You didn't ask why. You could have. You could have said, "What did I do?" You could have listed the years, the days, the hours you stood, served, memorized the rhythms of the queen's breathing through a closed door. But you didn't, because you were trained never to ask questions, even when it was your own future being locked away. What replacing you meant someone else took your place. She stood too stiffly at first, knocked too loudly, let guests enter too quickly, missed the silent cues. You passed her in the corridor once. She didn't look at you. Maybe she had been told not to. Maybe she already knew. The quiet ones are always temporary. Your new post, you were moved to linen inventory, a cellar room, no light, no voices, just endless folded sheets, numbered ledgers, lye soap, and the sound of moths rustling in the dark. Corners? You were good at it. Of course you were. You'd spent your life listening to footsteps. Now you listened to fabric shift in the stillness. When you passed by her door sometimes, while delivering linens, you passed the queen's door again. It looked the same. The guards the same. The morning light across the stone just as soft. But you didn't slow your steps. You didn't glance sideways. Because if you did, if you paused, if you looked too long, it would hurt. And hurt, in the palace, is a liability. The time the queen asked it only happened once. A week or maybe months after your reassignment. You overheard it as a linen maid brushed past the queen's bath chamber. The queen had said absently, "Where is the maid who used to stand by my door?" No one answered, and she didn't ask again. You began to fade. Your name was never written in books. Your face never painted. Your footsteps never echoed the way the queen's did. You were there until you weren't. And yet, for years after, when the queen paused before entering her room, when she hesitated, just slightly, waiting for a signal that never came, you were still with her. In the space between silence and sound, final reflection, you were not a voice. You were not a title. You were not even seen. But you were the one who heard it all. You witnessed the crumbling of secrets, the rearranging of lies, the soft hum of royalty unspooling in real time. And then you were gone. No fanfare, no goodbyes, but somewhere in the creak of a hinge, in the hush before a queen speaks, your presence still lingers, because sometimes the quietest roles leave the loudest echoes. Before a plate touched the queen's hand, it passed through yours, not directly, of course. You weren't a cook or a server or a taster. You were a kitchen maid, lower than the scullery girls, further from the light, deeper into the heat. But it was your hands that scrubbed the roots, peeled the onions, soaked the leeks, plucked the birds, and stirred the base for sauces no one could pronounce. Every feast the queen ever smiled through started in your pain. In this section, you begin your journey in the royal kitchens, where food became a symbol of power and survival became a form of starvation. You will witness the hierarchy of hunger, the rituals of royal dining, and how those who fed the throne often ate nothing themselves. You woke before the fire had to be lit long before the bread was even mixed, and the ashes from the night before had to be cleared first. Your hands blackened before sunrise. You scraped out the soot with bare fingers. You bent over glowing embers. You held your breath so the dust wouldn't choke you, and when the fire finally caught, you fed it with soaked from the rain. The queen would never know that the warmth of her roast duck began with your burning knuckles. You weren't allowed to taste food, wasn't for you. Not even a crust, not even a scrap of skin from a cooked hen. To taste the queen's food was a crime, punishable, if not by law, then by fate. You cooked while hungry. You washed wine jugs with a stomach that groaned. You peeled apples for the queen's tart, while your own ribs pressed against your apron. Once a plum dropped, rolled beneath the table. You picked it up, held it, stared, then placed it on the silver tray. When the orders arrived, menus were posted by scribes, not cooks. They listed not just dishes but requirements. How many courses, what colors the food should match, which spices should be smelled first, and which must be hidden. You weren't expected to understand it. You were expected to obey. If a dish was too hot, too cold, too browned, too wet, you were the one beaten. Not the chef, not the steward. You, because you stirred it, even if you didn't taste it. The smell was the worst. It wasn't the fire, not the heat, not even the rats. It was the smell of food when you hadn't eaten. Spiced almonds, stewing meat, melted butter on fresh bread, roasted chestnuts and citrus, sauces so thick they painted the air, tarts so sweet they made your teeth ache just to smell them. You could feel the food, but you couldn't have it. That kind of cruelty is slow, intimate. It teaches obedience in a way no whip ever could. When the food went bad sometimes, a dish was rejected. The queen didn't like the temperature. A guest objected to the seasoning. The texture was too common. The pastry cracked. It was returned. But still you couldn't touch it, because it had been scented by royalty. It had been plated in gold. It had risen too high above you. So it was. Scraped into buckets, fed to dogs or pigs, or simply thrown into the garden trench. You watched a veal roast sink into the mud once. You hadn't eaten that day, you'd got sick once. Sit was just a fever, maybe from the damp, maybe from the lack of food. Your fingers trembled as you stirred. Your vision blurred from the heat. You dropped a ladle and it clattered across the stone. The head cook turned. Lazy girls don't last long in this kitchen. You weren't lazy, you were starving. But starvation isn't a language the palace understands. Not when the queen has 10 courses to get through before sunset. Final reflection: you prepared banquets for a woman who never saw you. You touched food that might as well have been marble statues. You cooked through hunger so deep it became a silence. Inside your bones, they said the queen's table was a symbol of abundance. But beneath it, you learned, abundance for one always means absence for another, and you were the absence. The queen's table glittered gold-rimmed plates, crystal goblets, rare fruits stacked in pyramids, meats carved with blades so sharp they could slice breath. Musicians played while she chewed. Courtiers laughed between bites. And in the kitchens below, you folded into the stone wall, stomach clenching, hands blistered, watching food you prepared pass into a world you were never allowed to touch. In this section, the world of royal feasting unfolds through your eyes. A maid who served the most opulent meals in Europe, yet whose belly remained empty. It is a tale of invisible starvation, ritualistic waste, and the painful clarity that comes only when you watch others eat while you hunger. The feasts grew longer, once a month, then twice, then nearly every week. State dinners, seasonal celebrations, hunting returns, marriages, baptisms, visits from foreign ambassadors, victory days, name days. Even bad weather was turned into a feast, and for each, you worked 18-hour shifts. You peeled until your fingernails split. You crushed spices until your hands bled. You deboned fish with fingers trembling from fatigue. All so the queen could smile as pheasant was paraded before her, then eaten in 2 bites. The language of leftovers, you learned it quickly. When the roast was untouched, the queen was angry. When the tarts were halved, she was bored. When the goose was torn apart without elegance, she was drunk. When the soup returned full, someone else had cooked it. You could read her moods in the bones, scraped off her plate. You could guess who had pleased her or disappointed her by which desserts remained. It was a private language, shared only by those who fed but were never fed. The meat hallucination, it happened once. Late in autumn, you hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days. The kitchen fires were burning from dawn to dusk. The cold made your joints stiff. And then, out of nowhere, you swore you saw it. A leg of lamb, perfectly glazed. On the table alone, no one was watching. You stepped forward. But it wasn't lamb, it was wood. A serving dummy, painted, shined, false. Your eyes had imagined a feast from a prop. You laughed, then cried, then went back to scraping bones from a real duck that you wouldn't taste. When food became a weapon, it wasn't just denied, it was used against you. A spoiled onion left in the pot. Punishment to little sauce. Withheld bread for 3 days. Late delivery of spices. No evening meal. Food became a currency you didn't control. You watched boys in velvet hose gorge themselves on cherries while you licked flour from your palm. When no one was looking, the poisoned tart, they said. It was an accident. For a visiting baron made its way to the queen's plate. She didn't eat it, but someone did. A footman, young, barely older than you, collapsed by the cistern before anyone noticed. After that, food was guarded like gold, which meant more tasks for you, more precautions, more punishments, but not more food. The day you collapsed, you didn't even fall. You simply leaned too hard against the table and slid to the floor. Your legs stopped answering. Your vision went dark. You woke up on a pile of kitchen cloths. A scullery girl had covered you with damp linen. No one else had noticed. The stew still needed stirring, so you crawled to the pot and stirred, because if you didn't, someone else would, and that someone would never let you return. Final reflection: you weren't feeding a queen. You were feeding an Amiga, story of power and grace and wealth. Your work was silent. Your hunger ignored. Your body invisible. And yet, every plate they lifted into the light bore the fingerprints of your suffering. They said that Queen ruled with dignity, but her dignity was dressed in sauce, arranged in perfect circles, placed on platters polished by starving hands. You never tasted her world, but she lived through yours. Bite by bite, the kitchens smelled of roasting meat the day you were replaced. Not for failure, not for theft, not for insubordination, for something far simpler. You'd lost too much weight. The steward called it aesthetic hygiene. The new visiting physician called it unsightly to have gaunt maids near food. You were removed from the royal kitchen, quietly, without resistance. Not for your hands, not for your skill, but because your hunger had become visible. This final section closes. The story of a maid who built the queen's feasts while starving beneath the tableland. How in the end, her crime wasn't eating too much. It was showing she hadn't eaten at all. You were sent to cold storage. It was called cold storage, but it was really just a dark room carved into the stone beneath the palace. Barrels of salted fish, blocks of cheese so hard they bent knives, wheels of mold-dappled preserves, ropes of garlic hanging like garlands, shelves of pickled fruits sealed with wax dot, everything inedible to you. You recorded stock, rotated barrels, wrote dates, counted jars, lifted lids, sealed rot. You breathed in the air of food you'd never touch, and your stomach stopped growling. You became unnecessary one morning. You found another girl scribbling on your inventory chart. She didn't look up. She was already ahead of your schedule. No one told you she'd been sent. You waited for someone to explain. No one did, so you folded your apron, walked out of the storeroom, and nobody stopped you. You thought of stealing. One say plum. Again, years after the first, left too long in the bin, overripe, collapsing on one side. Sweet and ugly, you held it in your palm. The queen was upstairs, eating quail, drizzling honey on bread with a spoon made of gold. You could eat the plum just once, but you didn't, because you still remembered what it meant to serve. even when no one saw you, even when your body was fading, even when the queen wouldn't know. You would. You laughed the day you were free. Freedom didn't come with coin or thanks, or even a name in a ledger. It came in the form of a dismissed servant's pass. You were told, "We thank you for your service. You are no longer required." And you laughed, not out of joy or anger, but because you had no idea what food tasted like anymore. And you couldn't remember the last time you'd sat down during a meal. Freedom, to you, smelled like burnt flour and wet onions. You passed the queen's table one last time as you were leaving. It was being set. 12 forks, 8 knives, 4 cups, 3 plates, all for one person, each piece polished, each napkin folded with citrus peel tucked into the crease. She would eat alone that day, surrounded by your silence, your hunger, your skill. She would never know it was your last hour in the palace, but she would eat your work. Anyway, final reflection, you fed a queen without ever touching a spoon. You built feasts with blistered hands and an empty stomach. You survived without survival being noticed, and then you vanished. They said you were weak, but really, you were too strong to taste what was forbidden, too strong to steal what you earned, too strong to show what they refused to see. You starved with dignity, so the queen could dine in comfort, and that was the closest thing to loyalty you ever owned. Your world is damp, linen soaked in rosewater, gowns streaked with dust, sheets yellowed with time, stockings stiff with dried perfume. But deeper than any dirt or sweat lies what only you are forced to handle. The secret stains dots the queen's laundry maid. You don't just clean, you erase. In this story, we enter the quiet, sour world of the palace laundries where nothing was allowed to seem dirty, and the job of keeping a queen pure fell to the invisible girl beneath the floorboards. Laundry isn't a chore, it's a burial you don't fold. You shroud. Every cloth carries something that needs hiding, a secret wrapped in silk, a mistake clinging to muslin, a body's betrayal caught in the hem of a royal undergown. You lift each one gently, as if it's alive, because sometimes it still is, warm, wet, smelling of fear. You never ask questions. There's blood on the inner lining of a coronation dress. No one says why. There's a greenish smear on the hem of a gown that wasn't worn near any garden. You don't ask. You see stitching torn in a place that could only tear from force. You don't ask. Your fingers move. Your brush dips. The water clouds. You clean. Washing the queen's bed sheets every week. Streaks of red, spots of brown, hair you're not supposed to recognize. Scented oils meant to mask something deeper. You lift the fabric and lower it into the hot water. The heat bites your arms. You scrub until your fingers wrinkle, then blister. Once a new girl gagged. She didn't last the week. You stopped smelling anything at all. The lie of white linen. Royal linen must be white. Blinding white, the kind of white that hurts your eyes, but that color isn't natural. It's built from hours of soaking in lye, milk, urine, and ashes. You stir it all with a long wooden paddle. Your back screams, your lungs sting. Then you beat the fabric on stone. Fold, beat again. Lay it in the sun. Repeat. The queen lies on pain-bleached cloth and never feels the burn. The nightgown, no one claimed you found it buried in the wrong basket. Fine lace, expensive ribbon, a neckline not meant for sleeping alone. It was damp, lightly torn, stained at the chest, a rip at the hem. It did not belong to the queen, But you washed it anyway, because you knew who it belonged to, and you knew what it would cost her if it was found. Sometimes your job is not to ask who. It's simply to make it disappear. When you washed blood that wasn't hers, a noble woman came down, white-faced, clutching a gown. She fell, was all she said. The gown was ruined. The steward told you to clean it. Quietly, quickly, you washed, until your wrists bled. You never saw that noble woman again. But months later, you saw that gown repurposed, its fabric turned into the Queen's new cushion cover. The stain was gone. The memory stayed, final. Reflection, you were not a cleaner. You were a keeper of secrets. The Queen's image was spotless because your hands were stained. She remained graceful because you scrubbed the truth from her. Wardrobe, they said the Queen wore dignity, but you knew she wore laundered lies, and you carried them all, in silence, in suds, in skin rubbed raw from someone else's sins. Water doesn't argue, it doesn't flatter or deceive. It doesn't care about titles. It simply absorbs blood, perfume, wine, milk, sweat, vomit, urine, grease. And when you're the Queen's laundry maid, you spend your life with your arms submerged in it, soaking away the very evidence of what the palace refuses to name. This section brings us deeper into the life of the woman tasked with scrubbing out royal shame. You'll hear what the sheets whispered when no one else listened, and how truth can live longer in a fabric's thread than in a queen's memory. There was a smell, you came to know it. Wasn't bad, it was complicated. A mix of lilies, rose, oil, burnt sugar, and something sour underneath. A scent that didn't belong to a person but to a story. Whenever that smell clung to the Queen's garments, you knew she'd spent the night crying. You couldn't say how you knew. You just did. And so, when that scent appeared, you treated the cloth more gently, not out of duty, but out of something else, a quiet, unnamed grief. The Queen's corsets told the truth. Inside of a corset speaks louder than a diary. You cleaned dozens, some stiffened with sweat, some smeared with ointments for bruises no one admitted, some tore at the boning, as if she'd ripped it off in rage. Others had stitching chewed through at the edge, like someone biting cloth to keep from screaming. You said nothing, you just sewed it shut again, and dipped it in lavender water to make it forget. When you were summoned in the night, it was rare. But it happened. A footman knocked. You followed in silence. A soiled shift, a stained mattress cover, a muffling of voices behind velvet. No explanation. You weren't there to ask. You were there to clean, to wipe away what happened so that it could officially never have happened at all. The Queen's dignity demanded that you forget what her sheets remembered. You learned to wash pain gently. Anger leaves hard marks, but sorrow stains differently. It sinks, quiet, deep. The Queen had a white sleeping robe with gold trim. She wore it on days after funerals, on nights when her eyes were red. One night, you found it in the laundry bin, ripped at the sleeve, smudged with ash, the gold thread, dulled by tears. You washed it slowly, as if it might unravel from too much touching. Some garments, you realized, needed more than water. They needed to be forgiven. When you saw something you shouldn't have, it was a small embroidered cloth, tucked inside a rolled-up bedsheet, not stained, just hidden on it, a stitched name. Not the Queen's, a man's name, not her husband's. You held it a little too long. The steward snatched it from your hand. He said nothing, but you weren't called to work for 2 days. Your rations were halved. When you returned, your bucket was colder than before. Some stains aren't for removing, therefore protecting, even from you. The queen never thanked you, not once. She never sent a note, never asked a name, never questioned where her favorite underthings went when they were ruined and returned whole. But she also never complained. She never said the cloth was too scratchy, never sent back a sheet twice, never accused the laundry of mishandling her image. Perhaps that was her version of thanks, a silence that did not punish, but still, you were more loyal to her garments than anyone was to you. Final reflection. Cannot lie, and neither could you. You didn't tell the queen's secrets. You washed them. You didn't steal her beauty. You restored it, and you didn't ask for credit only, a little warmth, a little bread, a dry place to sleep. But even those were luxuries, because, in the end, your life was not stitched into gowns or embossed on linens. It was poured down the drain, with everything else she didn't want to remember. Eventually, the stains changed. Less blood, more ink, more wax, bits of letters burned halfway, secret seals pressed into silk, smudges from trembling hands, the signs of a queen more frightened of words than wounds. By then, you were no longer just a laundry maid. You were an unspoken part of the queen's ritual of forgetting. This final section closes. The story of the woman who laundered not just the queen's clothing, but her past, one water-warped thread at a time. It is a quiet goodbye to the unrecorded woman who held power without a voice, and bore the weight of royal silence with nothing but her own. You found the fabric that was once a curtain, silk so fine it hummed when you shook it. It had been hung near the queen's private writing desk. When it came to you, it smelled like wax and salt, not sea salt. Tears, there were no visible stains. But as you soaked it, the water clouded murky and heavy. It resisted drying, held moisture, longer than any fabric should, as if the cloth itself refused to forget what it had seen. You realized you were trusted not openly, not kindly, not officially, but deeply, but deeply. No one else was ever sent to wash the queen's morning clothes. No one else was called when a personal shift needed mending before morning. No one else handled her pillowcases. You never spoke, never repeated what you saw, never lingered too long on any one garment. And because of that, you became the only maid the queen never replaced. When you were tucked, it happened once. Years into your service, the queen was leaving for a procession. You stood to the side with a fresh veil still warm from the iron, wrapped in linen. She passed by, paused, and took it from you herself. Her gloved hand brushed your wrist. Just a touch, and she said, "Thank you." 2 words, she never said them again, but they lived in your skin like heat. You thought about leaving you, imagined it often. A warm cottage, a simpler life, a place where sheets didn't scream at you in silence. You thought of escaping with the next trade cart, with the stable boy, with the seamstress who once asked if you'd ever seen the queen cry. But you never left, because if you didn't care for the things the queen wanted forgotten, who would? And what would happen if someone else remembered them instead? Your hands grew numb. Years passed. Your hands no longer blistered, they just faded. You could dip them into scalding water and feel nothing. You could scrub through blood and ink, and tears and perfume, and not twitch. You became part of the laundry room, as much a fixture as the paddles and the tubs and the battered stone. Your body grew quiet, but your memory didn't. The last garment you washed it was her death gown, white, plain, lined with lace at the wrist. No embellishment, no perfume, no stain. You washed it slowly, pressed it flat, folded it neatly, laid it in a wooden box lined with lavender. You were not invited to the funeral, but when they closed the lid, you knew you had sent her into the earth clean. Final reflection, you were never named, never thanked in ceremony, never honored in story, never painted into a scene. But your work touched the queen more closely than any royal robe or polished crown. You preserved her silence. You erased her errors. You gave her the illusion of perfection. And when history wrote her as flawless, it was only because you wrung her sins from the cloth first. You weren't a servant. You were the ghost of the truth, folded, washed, hung to dry, and forgotten. The queen never dressed herself, not once, not her gowns, not her gloves, not her shoes. Every layer, every corset, every sleeve, every strand of hair was prepared, lifted, adjusted, tied, buttoned, and corrected by someone else. And that someone was you. You knew her body better than her physicians. You saw her before the paint, before the jewels, before the smiles, but she never saw you. This story descends into the strange, wordless world of the queen's personal dressing maid, the woman who saw everything and was expected to be nothing. It's a story of proximity without intimacy, closeness without recognition, and what it means to live a breath away from power you're forbidden to hold. You entered the chamber first, before she rose. Before the windows were opened, before the courtiers gathered outside with petitions and smiles, you lit the fire, warmed the slippers, laid the silk robe across the foot of the bed, then stood facing the wall and waited. When she stirred, a bell rang, and only then did the day begin. The queen didn't speak in the mornings, not to you. She let you wash her face, hold the cloth, pat dry, comb her hair in silence. Your fingers moved with precision, because a knot, a tug, a moment too long at the scalp would be noticed, would be punished. She didn't have to say anything. Her silence was its own script, and you followed it perfectly. You knew her smells before the perfumes, before the oils, before the roses tucked in her bodice. You knew the real ones, salt from sleep, musk from fear, smoke from the night's fire clinging to her skin, a faint sour note when illness came. She would never know you could recognize her by scent alone, but you could. Every morning there were things you couldn't look at. You stood close enough to button her corset, close enough to see the bruises that lace couldn't hide, close enough to glimpse the way her eyes lingered too long in the mirror, when she thought no one was watching. But you never looked her in the eye, not once. That was the rule, because to be seen seeing her was more dangerous than making her bleed with a pin. The gowns were armor, they weighed more than she did, layers of fabric, steel supports, chains of pearls, whalebone, silk, velvet, jewels. You helped her step into them like a knight into plate. You fastened her into perfection. You watched her posture shift the moment the last clasp snapped shut. Whatever she had been before, woman, daughter, sister, widow, she was now a queen, because you made her one. Your hands knew more than your voice ever could. They trembled when she had fever. They held fast when she flinched. They stitched tears back into sleeves without asking why, and when her hair fell, outstressed perhaps, or poison. Or grief you learned to twist and pin what remained so she'd never know you knew. You were replaced once briefly. A noblewoman insisted her cousin take over the role. Said it was a matter of status. You were reassigned to polishing boots. The queen didn't object, but a week later, you were called back without explanation. The cousin had bruised her wrist with a clasp, spilled powder into her eye, laughed too, loud when asked to fetch something. You returned to your place, silent, swift, and the queen never mentioned it again. Final reflection: you were not invisible. You were essential, but not for your thoughts, not for your voice, only for your hands, only for your silence, only for your ability to make her flawless before the world ever saw her. She walked through halls like a goddess, but you dressed the statue, and the statue never thanked the sculptor. The queen was a symbol to the world, but to you she was a body, one that grew tired, one that aged, one that bruised, bloated, bled, and broke. You wrapped her wounds in silk. You lifted her skirts when she could not walk. You powdered her chest when it trembled with fever. You learned how to disappear in the one room where the queen had no crownly skin. In this section, you come closer than anyone ever did to the real woman behind the throne. Not because she trusted you, but because she needed you to see everything, while pretending not to see it all. The mirror-light you saw her first, always before the powder, before the rouge, the wigs, the shaped gowns, before the dressers and the chamberlain and the official portrait painters. And each morning, you watched her look at herself, her jaw tighter, her lips pressed, her eyes darting to the places where age had crept in overnight. You never said a word, but you held the cream a little longer that day, loosened the corset half an inch, chose a darker bodice. You adjusted reality. The bruises grew. Strategic she didn't explain them. A purple ring along the ribs, a yellowing mark near the shoulder, sometimes hidden, sometimes exposed on purpose, perhaps to send a message. One time, you brushed her wrist while fastening a sleeve, and she winced sharply. You whispered, "Forgive me, Majesty." She didn't answer, but she held her arm still so you could finish the buttoning. That was her permission. That was her trust. You became a healer by necessity, not officially. Not with herbs or tonics, but with your hands. You knew how to brace a knee with linen, how to warm a cloth to ease aching joints, how to slide cool metal bracelets onto swollen fingers, how to pad shoes where bones had started to protest. You stitched more than fabric. You held her together with thread, pins, and silence. When she couldn't stand on it was a humid day. The queen had fasted for a religious rite. She hadn't slept. You saw it in her face before she even reached for the gown. You tried to delay fussing with lace, pretending a clasp was missing, but she insisted. She stood, then sank, slowly back onto the chair. You didn't speak. You brought her a robe instead, warmed it by the fire, draped it over her shoulders, moved quietly. She didn't meet your eyes, but she let you tie the sash. The first time she wept in front of you, it wasn't a sob, just a slow, quiet tear that fell. As you brushed her hair, you paused, then kept brushing. You didn't hand her a cloth, didn't offer comfort, because in your world, tears were not things to fix. They were things to fold into the hairline, pinned beneath the crown, powder over. You brushed until the tear dried on her cheek, and she never mentioned it. You knew when. She was dying not because they told you, but because her garments changed. simpler fabrics, easier closures, looser sleeves. A robe that could be removed without lifting her arms. Her voice faded too not from pain, but from fatigue. When you dressed her that final week, she didn't speak at all, and for the first time you looked at her dot just for a moment, and she let you. Final reflection: you never bowed in court, never signed a document, never received a coin stamped with your face, but you lifted the weight of royalty every day, lace by lace, shoe by shoe, wound by wound. You held her dignity together with your hands, and when history says the Queen never faltered, it will never know that was because you never did. There was no crown that morning, no trumpet, no mirror, just the Queen, pale, still waiting in silence for one last act of care. And you, her dressing maid alone, in the room where she had once become royalty each day. In this final section, you perform the most delicate ritual of all, dressing the Queen for death. Not as a servant, not as a subject, but as the only person who ever truly touched her, and never claimed a thing. The death gown had no buttons, just a tie at the collar, and a row of soft folds across the chest. You chose it yourself, from the linen wardrobe, not the fine silks, not the royal crimson, not the royal crimson. Something gentle, something that wouldn't scratch her skin. She had worn hundreds of gowns in her life, but only one would be remembered in death. And you made sure it didn't weigh her down. You braided her hair one last time. She once liked her hair long, then pinned, then powdered, then hidden. In her final days, it had grown thin, fragile as thread, but still you gathered it with care. No oils, no perfume, just your fingers and a steady breath, a small braid, tucked behind her ears, simple, honest, like a final apology from a life that had demanded too much beauty for too long. You placed her ring on the wrong hand, not by accident. Her official portrait showed the ring on her left hand, but her real hand, the one she'd always favored in private, the one that curled near her cheek when she slept, was the right dot. And so, when no one was watching, you slipped the signet onto the hand that had never held power, but had held grief, letters, and the wrist of a maid when she needed stillness. No one would notice, but you would know. You sat beside her before the others came. The bells hadn't rung yet. The chamberlain hadn't arrived. You had done your work, your duty. You could have left, but you stayed. Not long, just enough to whisper thank you. For the mornings, for the silences, for the days she let you do your job in peace. And maybe, just maybe, for the moment she didn't look away. They never asked who dressed her at the funeral. Nobles wept. They laid wreaths, composed sonnets, named her virtues. They called her graceful, untouchable, divine. But none of them knew how long she took to choose a pair of gloves, or how many pins it took to make her hair stay aloft. They didn't know her robes itched, or that her knees ached, or that once she fell asleep during her own coronation dress fitting. You knew, but you kept that to yourself, as always. Final reflection: they will remember the queen as a statue, a symbol, a flawless sovereign, but you will remember the soft curve of her spine when she was tired, the bruise beneath her shoulder blade, the smell of lavender clinging to her nightgown. Because you were not a servant, you were not a handmaid, you were not a shadow. You were the person who made her real, and then made her beautiful every single day. And in the end, you were the only one who gave her back to the world, dressed as she truly was. You never touched the crown, but you emptied what lay beneath it. Every morning, every evening, without praise, without pause. The queen ruled with elegance, but she relieved herself like everyone else. And you were the maid who carried that truth up stone steps, down velvet-lined corridors, through halls that pretended royalty didn't stink. In this story, we follow the woman who did the job nobody spoke of, tending the queen's chamber pot, the one who witnessed the most human part of royalty, and learned that even the greatest power in the land was not above the simple, stubborn fact of the body. You collected the pot before dawn. It wasn't porcelain. Not at first. In the early days, it was just a brass basin under a carved stool, hidden behind embroidered curtains. You'd slide it out, gently praying it hadn't tipped, hadn't leaked, trap it in cloth, and walk it down the servants' stair. The queen never saw you, but she smelled fresh linens because of you. She sat on velvet without ever thinking what lay beneath. She dined beside nobles, unaware you were cleaning what she left behind. There was always a bit of her left even. After emptying, rinsing, drying, there was always something. A faint scent of bile, a speck of blood, a hair stuck to the side. You learned to tell her health from it, when she'd eaten too much, when she was bleeding, when something inside her was wrong. The physicians guessed. You knew, because you saw what her body couldn't hide. You became her private physician, not officially, but when the queen's stomach soured, they called the court doctors. When you saw black streaks in her waist, you already knew the broth was too rich. When she fainted during a procession, they blamed nerves. You knew she hadn't relieved herself in days. You began leaving crushed mint leaves near her bedside. You suggested warm milk to her dresser. You swapped vinegar for honey in her tea. She never noticed your hand, but she stopped fainting. The royal body could not be discussed. The queen never farted, never sweated, never bled, at least according to court poets and official records. But you knew different. You changed the sheets after illness, scrubbed the stool when her bowels gave out during fever, laid cloths beneath her thighs when the midwife arrived at midnight, and when it was done, you washed the cloths, burned the rags, and returned the room to its myth, spotless, silent, regal. The worst was the summer fevers, the chamber pot filled with what no one dared name, dark, thick, unnatural. The queen trembled on her pillows, unable to rise. The maids gagged. The doctors whispered of poison, or spirits, or imbalances. But you carried the pot, carried the evidence, carried the truth. And you didn't flinch, because that was the job. You were ordered never to speak one day. A duke's wife entered the queen's chamber by mistake. She saw the pot, covered her mouth, fled. The next morning, the steward pulled you aside. Not a word, he said, not ever, not even to the other maids. And so, the part of the queen that most proved she was mortally, buried it in silence. While poets sang of her perfume, you knew it was lemon water and ash. While visitors praised her grace, you remembered the nights her body betrayed her, but you never said a word. Final reflection: you weren't invited to court. You weren't honored in ceremony, but you held the truest version of the queen in your hands. Not the crowned figure, not the painted smile, but the woman who ate, digested, strained, sickened, and bled. And you cleaned it all away, so no one else would ever have to know. They said the queen was divine. You knew better. She was human because you emptied the proof. Twice a day, they said the queen's court was built on marble and gold. But your kingdom was made of cracked tiles, lye buckets, and the sound of things no one dared name. While nobles dined on silver, you scrubbed the base of a wooden stool until it no longer smelled like fear, and every day you kept the lie alive, that the queen never needed relief, that her body was a temple, that her throne was spotless. The pot grew fancier, but never lighter in time. The chamber pot was replaced with porcelain, blue floral etchings, gold trim, a silver handle. It didn't matter, what filled it stayed the same. Your job just became more delicate. No scratches, no noise, no stains visible even under candlelight. The queen still never thanked you, but she also never saw a dirty pot twice, and that meant everything was working as it should. You knew her weaknesses before her doctors did. Some weeks her water smelled sour. Other weeks it turned pink. You noted the changes, quietly, mentally, without record. Once you whispered to the steward, "She needs more broth, less root, and rest." He frowned, but obeyed. 3 days later, the queen stood straighter, smiled wider. No one connected it to you, but you cleaned her pot that evening and smiled at what was missing. When the queen's monthly bleeding first you didn't notice, then the linens stayed white. The pot smelled different. The stains disappeared. You said nothing, but you began setting a warmer robe by the stool, placing cushions more carefully, watching how she winced after standing. Something inside her was changing. You saw it first, because you were always watching, even when no one else dared to look. The night of the secret birth, the palace never admitted it. No visitors, no bells, number, announcement. Just the sudden arrival of a midwife at midnight, and the quiet hum of pain from behind the queen's curtain. You were summoned after the pot was full, lined with blood. The cloths were soaked. You cleaned everything carefully, silently the next morning. The court resumed its rituals. No child was ever named, but the queen's eyes looked hollow, and you buried the evidence with your own hands. You heard the things she couldn't say. She talked in sleep. You weren't meant to hear, but during illness, during fevers, she murmured names, numbers. "Please, I'm sorry. Don't let them see. Tell no one." You never repeated what she said, not to the steward, not to the nurses, not even to the walls, because you understood her greatest fear wasn't pain. It was being known too clearly, and your job was to keep her clean inside and out. Final reflection: the queen ruled lands, commanded armies, banished nobles, but you carried her humanness. You lifted it with both hands, scrubbed it from cold porcelain, poured it down drains no historian will ever mention, and through that silence, you protected her myth. You weren't a maid. You were her last line of dignity, and all you ever touched was everything she tried to hide. You weren't at her bedside, but you knew she was dying. The queen had not used her chamber pot in 2 days. Not a drop, not a stain. Nothing. And that absence told you what no herald dared announce. Her body was already beginning to let go. This final section closes the story of the woman who carried the queen's most intimate truths through sickness, aging, grief, and quiet shame, not as a threat, not as a friend, but as a mirror she never had to look into. The last pot you emptied it was different, not in weight or smell, but in silence. When you carried it down the steps, no one crossed your path. No one handed you a cloth. No one whispered behind a fan. Everyone knew, but no one said it. Because if the queen still filled her chamber pot, she was still alive. And if you still carried it, then maybe nothing had changed. The chamber was too quiet. The queen didn't moan, didn't breathe heavy, didn't cry. Out, she simply faded, and the space behind the curtain, once thick with scent, heat, and tension grew cool. You stood just beyond the partition, cloth in hand, waiting for the bell that would never ring. When the steward entered, his eyes flicked to yours. "You may go," he said. But you didn't. Not yet. You laid the pot down one last time. No one saw you. You washed it slowly, dried it by hand, polished the rim with oil and linen until it gleamed. You didn't do it for the next queen. You didn't do it for duty. You did it because it was the last piece of her that still felt real to you, more than her throne, more than her portraits. That pot had held every fear, every sickness, every moment of truth her smile tried to hide. And now it too was empty. They buried her in lace silk down to the ankles, gloves up to the elbows, perfumed until the scent clung to the floorboards. She was laid in state, distant and glowing, but you knew the last thing her body touched before death was the same brass rim you'd scrubbed for a decade, the same bucket that received her every vulnerability. And now they said she was divine. The chamber became someone else's new queen, a new basin, new perfumes, new linens, but the pot remained. You noticed the new lady couldn't hold her bladder during travel, that her bowels reacted poorly to rich meats, and so you adjusted, again quietly, precisely as you always had, because royalty changes. But what royalty leaves behind, that always ends up in your hands. Final reflection. History remembers what the queen built, the laws she signed, the lovers she buried, the gowns she wore, but not the part of her that trembled in pain, that stained. Cloth that moaned in the night, that leaked, cracked, and broke like any other human being. You held that part, not with judgment, but with care, because someone had to, and if no one else ever says it, thank you for carrying what the crown refused to. Each evening, after the last goblet was drained, After the nobles whispered their good nights, after the crown was placed back in its velvet case, you began your work. The queen's hair was a kingdom of its own. Braided, curled, scented, pinned, powdered, then unspooled again by your hands, strand by careful strand. But brushing the queen's hair was never just about grooming. It was when her mask slipped, when her voice softened, when she stopped being a monarch and became something far more dangerous. Honest. This story follows the maid who stood behind the queen every night, brush in hand, catching the words that no one else ever heard. You were taught never to speak first. The rule was simple: silence, not a cough, not a sigh, not even the rustle of skirts. The queen's brush strokes set the pace, slow, long drags down her back, each pass a beat in an unspoken ritual. But if she spoke even a single word, you were to listen, not answer, not question. Just listen, because what was said during hairbrushing never left the chamber, ever. The first time she spoke, it was winter. The fire cracked. Her curls were damp with melted snow. Your fingers moved carefully, she said. He never kissed me, not once. You didn't ask who. She didn't explain. But her shoulders dropped slightly, just enough for you to know. The truth had waited a long time to be said. And from that night forward, she began to talk. Her secrets were never loud. She whispered them, not like confessions, more like thoughts spilled into the dark. I think they want my sister to take my place. They say I have a temper, but what else should I have? I miss my mother, even though she hated me. You kept brushing. You never nodded, never winced, never showed surprise, because her secrets needed stillness, not sympathy. Some nights were completely silent. Those were the hardest, when her hair tangled easily, when her lips pressed into a thin line, when her hands clutched the edge of the vanity. Those were the nights when you brushed more slowly, loosened the strands, poured lavender oil into the comb. You didn't try to fix her silence. You just made sure it didn't pull too hard. You heard names that never appeared in recordsmen with common faces, women whose letters arrived without seals. She whispered their names like prayers, some fondly, some with regret, some like curses too old to repeat out loud. You memorized none of them, because the power in a secret is not just knowing it, it's knowing how to let it pass through you, like a breeze, like a ghost. She once asked you a question, do you think I'm cruel? It wasn't rhetorical. You froze brush mid-stroke, because this was forbidden. You weren't meant to answer, but her eyes met yours in the mirror, and so, after a long breath, you said, I think you were tired. She looked away, but didn't correct you, and you continued brushing. Final reflection: history will never write down what the queen said as her hair was unpinned. The state records will not list the tears caught in the strands. The scrolls won't recall the night she whispered, I don't want to be queen anymore. But you remember the weight of the brush, the heaviness of her words, the quiet ache in your own arms as you carried her secrets without ever saying a word. You weren't just a maid, you were a witness, and your silence held up everything the queen never dared admit out loud. The queen wore the crown with grace, but you saw what it left behind: indentations, bruises, hair ripped from the scalp, powder crusted into the roots. Every evening, it was your job to untangle not just her curls, but the pieces of monarchy itself, and slowly, as the strands loosened, so did her composure. Because even a queen must unravel sometime. The crown left a mark. She wore it for hours, ceremonies, parades, audiences. It seemed weightless to the public, but when you removed it, you always found the same thing. A raw circle of pressure where the gold had sat. Red skin, sometimes swollen, sometimes broken. You'd dab it with rose water. Gently, quietly, she'd flinch, but she never complained. The court saw the crown as divine, but you knew it was just another thing that hurt her. She asked you to cut her hair once, just a few inches. From the back, no one would notice. You did it quickly, silently. When the strands fell to the floor, she looked down at them for a long time. Then she said, "That's the only part of me that still belongs to me." She said it like a joke, but you knew it, WASN, single quotes. And when you swept the hair away, you held it in your hand like it was a secret she could no longer carry herself. Some nights, she was a child. Again she would sit with her knees tucked under her robe, hair loose, crown already packed away. You'd brush in silence, and she would hum no songs of court or country, just little melodies, forgotten tunes from before she ever ruled. Once, she said, "My nursemaid used to sing this to me when I was too scared to sleep." And that night, she asked you not to finish the braid. She just wanted her hair down, like when she was small and safe. So you let it fall across her shoulders, and she slept deeply. You became her confessional. She stopped seeing the royal priest, stopped trusting the courtiers, but you brushed. And that made you safe, she told you. Of decisions she regretted, of nights she couldn't sleep, of a letter she burned instead of sending and wondered if it would have saved someone's life. She told you these things, not for counsel, but because if she didn't say them somewhere, they'd rot inside her. So you listened, and you never told a soul when her hair turned gret. Didn't happen all at once, just a few threads at the temple, a streak near the nape. She noticed before anyone else. "Don't pull them," she said. So you didn't. You brushed them the same way. Soft, careful, respectful. And over time, she began asking you to leave her hair plain. No powder, no pins, no wigs, just as it was. "Earned this color," she said. "Let them see it." But only after you brushed it smooth. Final reflection, the queen's hair was her veil, her shield, her silent stage. To the public, it was styled perfection. To the court, it was a symbol of order. But to you, it was the place where she hid her grief, her regrets, her truest self. Each knot you untangled held the weight of a secret. Each braid you tied sealed it in place again. You weren't just her maid. You were her keeper of softness. In a world that demanded she always be steel, she didn't ask for you, but you came anyway. The queen had not risen from bed in 2 days. Her arms lay limp on the silk. Her voice was only a whisper, and her hair, once perfumed and perfect, was now tangled and dull. They called for priests, for physicians, for heirs, but no one called for you. Still, you entered her chamber one last time, brush in hand, and did what you had always done, not because she needed it, but because she deserved it. Her hair was thinner than you remembered, barely covered her shoulders. Strands broke as you touched them. You brushed carefully, less like grooming, more like a final farewell. She didn't speak, but her breathing softened as you moved. She was slipping, but you made sure she felt beautiful at the end. Not like a queen, not like a symbol, just like a woman who'd been so tired for so long. You chose not to braid it. Tradition said her hair should be plaited before death, tied in a royal knot, fixed with jeweled pins. But you left it loose. Soft waves spread across the pillow, free for the first time in decades. No powder, no crown, just her. That was your rebellion, your kindness, your way of saying, you are enough, even without the kingdom. When they found her, they whispered. The nobles saw her hair and frowned. She should have looked more proper, someone said. But the lady-in-waiting, older than the rest, spoke quietly. Let her rest how she truly was. And no one argued, because deep down they all knew the queen they buried had been far. Too many things, too far, too many people. But to one maid, in one quiet chamber, she had been just herself. You were not asked to attend the funeral, of course not. You watched from the gallery, far away from the silk-lined casket. So before she retired, you were ordered to slip beneath the covers. Lie still, heat it with your body, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for nearly an hour, and you were not to fall asleep. You were always gone before she arrived. You listened for the soft footfall in the corridor, the rustle of nightgowns, the creak of brocade. Then you rose, smoothed the sheets, slipped out the side door, and you never made eye contact, because you were not meant to be remembered, only felt a ghost of warmth. Your warmth was the first thing she touched, not her own thoughts, not her husband, not her memories. Your warmth, your heat lingered in the hollow of the mattress, in the bend of the knees, in the curve of the back, and, for a moment, her body knew ease, but she never knew whose body made it possible. Sometimes the bed was soaked with fear. There were nights when she trembled, not from cold, but from something else. A message received, a threat unspoken, a decision made. You'd find the sheets already damp with sweat, though she hadn't even arrived, so you lay in it anyway, curled into the shape she would take. Let her know without ever seeing your face that someone had already survived the fear for her. No, one thanked you not once. Not the steward who barked the order, not the chambermaid who fetched your shift. Certainly not the queen, who never even learned your name. They all acted as though warmth simply happened, as if the bed loved her back, but you knew it was your bones, your breath, your flesh, that burned away the chill, and when your fingers went numb afterward, you just lit a candle and waited for the next bed. They called her regal, graceful, untouched by discomfort, but you know the truth, even royalty shivers. Even queens hate the cold. Even palaces cannot insulate the ache of night. You were not a servant of glory. You were a servant of silence, and every night you gave your body, so hers could rest like a goddess. Each night you gave the queen your warmth, and each night you went home to cold stone floors. No down mattress, no fire, no silks, just your own skin, chilled from service, and the memory of a bed that was never really yours. In this section, we explore what it meant to give physical comfort, while receiving none, to sacrifice your own ease so that someone else could float through a world free of discomfort. unknowing, untouched, and completely unaware of your name. You weren't allowed a hearth knot in the servants' wing, not in the lower quarters. Heat was reserved for the noble blood. Your shared room had cracked windows, thin wool blankets, no coals unless someone died. And so you huddled with other maids, back to back, fingers tucked into sleeves. But even then, your chill was different. It came from knowing your body had already given its best heat to someone who would never know your face. You were the warmth she trusted most, more than the fire, more than her husband, more than any fur-draped throne. Your heat never asked her questions, never betrayed her, never demanded. That made it sacred and disposable, because the moment she laid her head down, you were already gone. There were rules you couldn't break. You must never speak while in the Queen's bed, never leave behind a hair, never wrinkle the sheets. Your breathing must be shallow, your exit must be silent. Once, a maid forgot to tuck the pillow precisely. The Queen noticed. She was dismissed that same day, so you practiced folding and smoothing with military precision, leaving no trace of your own night, only hers. Sometimes you felt her step into your warmth. You were still fixing the corner when she arrived too early. You froze kneeling beside the bed. Eyes down, she stood by the mattress, fingers trailing the spot you had just left. For one moment, her fingers hovered above your warmth, the hollow your body had left behind. She said nothing, and you said even less, but in that breathless space, your presence was more real than it had ever been. Then she dismissed you with a nod, and it was over. The night she didn't come, you waited. The bed was made. Your shift was damp with sweat. Still, no one came. Finally, a footman passed the door, muttering, "She's taken ill, sleeping in the nursery tonight." You looked at the pristine bed, still warm, still shaped to her body, and for the first time you slipped into it again, not to serve, not too warm, but to remember what it felt like, to be important enough to lie here just once, just for a moment. Final reflection. They called her beloved, blessed by God, too delicate to feel the cold, but her comfort was built on bodies like yours, bodies that were never seen, never held, never named. You weren't her friend, you weren't her enemy, you were the fire beneath her sheets, and when history praises her calm sleep in a cold castle, they will never know you were the reason. She never shivered. It ended without ceremony. One evening, the steward came down the corridor with a folded paper in his hand. He didn't look up as he spoke. "The Queen has requested a warming pan instead. You're relieved of the duty." And just like that, your body was no longer required, not because you failed, not because you aged, but because someone invented a tool that could replace your warmth without breath, without bones, without ever needing to be thanked. And the bed you once lived inside forgot you ever existed. The iron pan had no pulse. It hissed, it steamed, it slid under the sheets on a long brass handle. The Queen approved. It did not wrinkle the linens, it did not shed hair, it did not sweat, but it also did not sense the shape of her back, did not know where her spine curved, where her toes tucked, where the chill lingered longest. It was perfect, and it was empty. You were sent to the laundry cellar. No more chamber doors, no more silent evenings beside her fire. Now it was vats of boiled water, steam scalding your wrists, lye that burned your fingernails until they cracked. They said it was a lateral reassignment. They said it was an honor to remain in royal service. But you knew what it meant. They didn't need your warmth anymore, just your labor. You still dreamed of the bed knot in longing, in muscle memory. Your arms twitched at midnight, still expecting to fold the corners. Your skin prickled as though the chill of the sheets were calling you back. But the bed didn't remember you, and neither did she, because what royalty receives is never meant to be remembered if it comes too quietly. The queen aged while you faded. She grew frailer, thinner, a bit more brittle each year. She clutched the quilts tighter, demanded thicker robes, ordered fires lit even in spring. But you weren't there to see it. You were bleaching under things, hauling sheets twice your weight, losing feeling in your fingers. You warmed her body once. Now you burned your own hands to keep others' linen white. The day she died, you were boiling her towels. No bell was rung for you, but you heard the church bells, 12 chimes, one for each year you had served in silence. Someone dropped a bundle of robes beside your feet and whispered, "She died just before dawn. In her sleep, they say she looked peaceful." You nodded, but you knew better. No one dies peacefully in a bed warmed by iron. They buried her in silk. They called her eternal. They praised her poise in the coldest of winters. But you know, the peace she wore in life was not forged in steel or blood or divine grace. It was human warmth, given freely, taken quietly, forgotten completely. And though the world may not remember the girl who gave her own body to warm a queen's sleep, you remember, and that is enough. You were never meant to wear it. The queen's perfume, pressed from violet petals, steeped in amber oil, sealed in glass no bigger than a thumb, was sacred, expensive as a crown, guarded like a relic. You carried it, not in your hand, but in a velvet pouch hung from a golden chain, close to your chest, always warm from your skin. And when she called, you unscrewed the stopper with care, tilted the bottle just once, and let the tiniest drop land where she pointed neck, wrist, breastbone, but it was never for you. This is the story of the maid who carried the queen's scent through every corridor, every court, every crisis, but was never permitted to keep even the faintest whiff of it for herself. The perfume arrived in lockboxes. It didn't travel with the rest of her powders or combs. It had its own satchel, its own guard, its own key, kept by the queen's personal attendant, handed only to you during the ritual of scenting. 1 bottle per season. A different blend each time. Spring's perfume was floral, summer's citrus and crushed mint. Autumn brought hints of myrrh. Winter, always sandalwood, sharp, dry, clean. You knew the schedule by heart, but not by scent. You were never allowed to inhale deeply. You were trained in the art of one dropped too much, and the queen would sneeze. Too little, and her rivals would claim she smelled unwashed. You were taught the angle, the height, the exact pressure of the stopper, how to dot her pulse without ever touching her skin, because the queen could not smell like commoners, and you could not smell like the queen. Dotsu, you washed your own hair in vinegar. Your clothes were scrubbed in lye. Your body, scentless as paper. You were invisible beside her cloud of amber and rose. The scent entered rooms before she did it, drifted ahead of her. Soft, haunting, unforgettable. At banquets, it made heads turn. In church, it silenced whispers. In war councils, it reminded old men that they bowed not just to a monarch, but to a myth. You walked behind her, holding nothing but the empty bottle. The queen never looked back, but you saw their faces, the envy, the awe, and not one of them ever imagined that the magic floating through the air came from your fingers. Once, a drop landed on your wrist. It was a mistake, a tremor in your hand. a single drop. And now, as the last grain settles, as the linen wraps one final time, and as the echo of forgotten footsteps fades into temple, stone, and desert wind, we close the scroll. You've walked through the quiet corridors of power, slept in red huts beside the Nile, sweated through salt and thread, and watched pharaohs become memory. You've seen that history doesn't always move through war or conquest. Sometimes it lies in a cloth, folded carefully, a mouth sealed with resin, or a single line scribbled in the margin of a grain ledger. The people you met today were not kings, not warriors, not gods, but they held the kingdom together. One weighed sack of barley, one charm tucked beneath a bandage, one whispered decision that never made it into the official story. And yet, here you are. You remember. That's all they ever needed. Thank you for walking with them. Close your eyes now. Let the sand drift. Let the scroll roll shut. And may your sleep be as peaceful as a tomb, sealed with care, and a name remembered in silence. Good night.